Tonight's story comes from a forest ranger assigned to a wilderness outpost so remote it doesn't even appear on most maps. It was supposed to be a routine overnight shift. Equipment checks, radio logs, and silence broken only by wind and distant wildlife. But before midnight, small details began to feel wrong. An extra boot print near the door. A chair that was still warm. A logbook entry written during hours. No one was scheduled to be there. What follows is a first-person account of a single shift that unraveled into something far more disturbing. No monsters. No legends passed down for campfire scares. Just procedures, isolation, and the creeping realization that someone, or something, was sharing the outpost, unseen and uninvited. This is my most terrifying shift. Unseen occupant in a wilderness outpost. A true scary story told from the perspective of the ranger who lived through it. Listen closely. In places like this, the quiet is never empty. My name is Derek Vaughn. I am writing this as a formal personal record of an incident that occurred during a single overnight assignment at an isolated wilderness outpost operated by the Regional Forest Service. I have been trained to document irregular wildlife behavior, weather anomalies, equipment failures, and human safety concerns with accuracy and restraint. What follows is written in that same spirit, even though I understand how improbable parts of it may sound when read aloud. I ask only that it be considered in full, without interruption, because the sequence of events matters more than any individual moment. I was assigned to Outpost K-19 for a routine overnight watch, beginning shortly before dusk and ending the following morning at 0700s. The outpost itself is a small, single-room structure raised slightly off the ground, positioned on a ridgeline above a long stretch of dense pine forest. There are no marked trails leading directly to it, only an access road that becomes impassable after heavy rain. That road was clear when I arrived. Weather conditions were stable. No storms were forecast. My radio check in at 1800 confirmed that I was the only staff member in the area for at least 20 miles. Inside, everything appeared normal. The generator was functioning. The radio crackled with low static, but responded correctly during test transmissions. The emergency kit was sealed. The logbook showed no unusual entries. The analog wall clock above the desk read 1842 when I set my pack down. I remember that clearly because I noted the time while synchronizing my wristwatch. Both matched exactly, down to the second. The clock was old, mechanical and loud in the way older clocks tend to be in quiet places. Each tick carried cleanly through the room. I have always found that sound grounding. It gives shape to time when everything else is still. I completed my initial inspection, locked the door, and prepared a simple meal. During all of this, the clock behaved exactly as expected. 1 second per tick. Consistent. Reliable. At approximately 19:15, I stepped outside to conduct my final daylight perimeter check. The forest below the outpost was already darkening, shadows folding into one another as the sun dropped behind the ridge. I stood still for a moment on the steps listening. Wind through the trees. Distant insect noise. Nothing out of place. When I went back inside, the clock read 1917. That was reasonable. 2 minutes had passed. I did not notice anything unusual until later, when the light had fully faded, and the interior of the outpost was lit only by the overhead lamp. I was seated at the desk, writing routine notes in the logbook, when I became aware of the ticking again. Not consciously at first, just a sense that it was busy. faster than before. I looked up at the clock. The second hand was moving at a pace that did not match my internal sense of time. I checked my wristwatch. It showed 20:03. The wall clock showed 20:06. I assumed user error. Perhaps I had misread one of them earlier. I reset the wall clock to match my watch and noted the adjustment in the logbook. Mechanical clock's drift. This was not remarkable. I returned to my notes. A few minutes later, I stood up to stretch. As soon as I did, the ticking seemed to settle back into a familiar rhythm. Slower, normal. I paused, half standing, listening. The sound felt right again. I sat back down. The ticking quickened. That was the first moment I felt genuine confusion. I stood fully this time, remaining absolutely still. The ticking slowed. I sat. It sped up. I repeated this several times, changing positions deliberately. Each time the same result. When I was in motion or standing, the clock behaved normally. When I was seated and still, the ticking accelerated. I approached the wall clock and watched it closely while standing. The second hand moved correctly. I sat down directly beneath it, keeping my eyes on the face. The hand began to advance faster, not in jerks or jumps, but smoothly, as if time itself had been compressed. I stood again. It slowed. I want to be clear about this. The clock did not stop or stutter. It did not function in a way consistent with mechanical failure. It changed pace in direct response to my stillness. I unplugged the clock from the wall. The ticking continued. At 21:10, I performed another radio check-in. My voice sounded normal to me. The dispatcher responded without concern. I did not mention the clock. At that point, I was still searching for a rational explanation, and saying it out loud felt premature. While I was speaking, standing near the radio, the ticking sounded normal. When the transmission ended and I sat back down, it accelerated again, loud enough now that I could feel it in my jaw. I began to avoid sitting. This may sound trivial, but fatigue sets in quickly when you deny your body rest. By 2200, my legs ached. I leaned against the wall instead, remaining technically upright. The clock stayed steady. The moment I closed my eyes, still standing, the ticking sped up. I opened them. It slowed. That was when the unease became something heavier. Not panic, exactly. More like the awareness that I was being observed by something that did not need eyes to see me. I covered the clock with a towel. The ticking came through the fabric faster. When I stood still, slower when I moved. I removed the batteries from my wristwatch and set it on the desk. It stopped completely, as expected. The wall clock did not. At 22:47, I noticed something else. Time outside the clock was behaving strangely too. My breathing felt out of sync with the seconds. The hum of the generator seemed to lag, then rush, then settle. When I paced the room, everything aligned again. When I stopped, the room felt like it was leaning forward, rushing ahead without me. I forced myself to sit, just once, to test it. The ticking became frantic. Seconds tearing past so quickly that the hand blurred. I stood abruptly, heart racing. The sound snapped back to normal immediately, like a reprimand. I did not sit again after that. By 20:30, I was exhausted. I leaned against the door, afraid to close my eyes for too long. Each time I grew too still. The ticking grew aggressive, almost impatient. It felt as though time itself was trying to move without me, and the only way to stay anchored was to keep moving, keep proving that I was present. I began to wonder what would happen if I failed to do that. I am ending this first part of my account here, because what followed required decisions that I did not make lightly. and the consequences of those decisions unfolded rapidly as the night deepened. I have recorded every minute since with as much clarity as I can manage. If you are reading this, please understand that at no point did I lose consciousness, experience hallucinations, or consume any substance that would impair my judgment. Everything that occurred happened within a single night, under normal conditions, in a place designed to keep people safe. And the clock is still ticking. I did not sleep at all after that realization. I stopped pretending that rest was possible and focused, instead on staying functional until morning. My training emphasizes routine as a stabilizing force in isolation, so I tried to impose structure on the night. I paced in measured intervals, checked equipment on a schedule, and logged times even though I no longer trusted what those times meant. At 2341, I noted that the wall clock read Suvard Windine. I was standing when I wrote that entry. The second hand was behaving normally, but the hour hand had advanced in a way that made no sense. Less than an hour had passed since my last note. My wristwatch, which I had restarted manually, read 2342. I set it down next to the logbook and watched both clocks while remaining upright. They stayed synchronized. When I sat down slowly, carefully, the wall clock surged ahead. The second hand blurred again, dragging the minute hand with it. My watch did nothing. It kept time like an object should. The wall clock reached 01703 before I stood again. The moment I did, it froze in place for half a second, then resumed normal ticking as if nothing had happened. That pause is important. It was the first time the clock hesitated. I unplugged the generator next, thinking vibration or electrical interference might be a factor, even though the clock was not dependent on power. The lights went out. The room fell into darkness broken only by my headlamp. The ticking did not change. If anything, it sounded clearer, sharper, like it appreciated the quiet. Without the generator, the outpost felt smaller. The walls seemed closer. Sound behaved differently. Every movement I made felt amplified. I forced myself to keep moving anyway, stepping heel to toe, counting my breaths, keeping my body in motion, even when my muscles screamed for rest. Around 00:30 by my watch, I made a mistake. I stopped walking and leaned forward, hands on my knees, just to catch my breath. I did not sit. I did not close my eyes. I was still standing. The ticking accelerated. Not as fast as when I sat, but faster than before. I straightened immediately and resumed pacing. It slowed, but not completely. The rhythm remained slightly off, as if the clock had learned something new about me. I began to understand then that stillness was not a binary condition. It was not just sitting or standing. It was submission, fatigue. The moment my body signaled weakness, the clock responded. At 00:58, I heard something else for the first time. Not a new sound, but an absence. The forest noises outside had faded. No insects, no wind. Nothing. I opened the door briefly, keeping one foot inside so I would not stop moving. The air was cold and dead still. The trees stood motionless, black against the sky. When I stepped back inside and closed the door, the ticking filled the space left by the forest. I tried the radio again at 01:05. No response, just static. I stood while transmitting, repeating my call sign, keeping my voice steady. The ticking stayed normal while I spoke. The moment I stopped talking, it sped up. I spoke again. It slowed. That was when the pattern became undeniable. Movement helped. Speech helped. Attention helped. Silence and stillness made the clock impatient. At 01:22, I did something I regret. I decided to test what would happen if I fully surrendered to exhaustion. just for a moment, while remaining conscious. I sat down on the edge of the bunk, back straight, eyes open, hands gripping the frame. The ticking exploded. There is no better word for it. It did not simply speed up. It became overwhelming, filling my head, drowning out my thoughts. The second hand spun so fast that the clock face blurred into a pale circle. The air felt thick, like pressure building before a storm. My chest tightened. I felt an intense urge to stand, but something held me there, not physically, but internally. Like hesitation stretched into paralysis. In that moment, I became aware of something deeply wrong with my perception of time. Thoughts felt elongated, stretched thin, while seconds vanished. I remember thinking that if I stayed seated long enough, the night would end without me. Morning would arrive, the shift would conclude, and I would still be there, anchored to a moment that no longer existed. That fear broke whatever hold I was under. I stood violently, nearly toppling the chair. The ticking stopped entirely. For 3 full seconds, there was silence. Then the clock resumed at a normal pace. I backed away from it, heart pounding. The wall clock now reads 04:11. My watch read 01:24. 3 hours had passed on the wall clock in less than 2 minutes. I did not log that discrepancy immediately. My hands were shaking too badly. I focused instead on staying upright, walking tight circles around the room, brushing my fingers along the walls to keep myself oriented. The room felt wrong now, larger somehow, like the space between objects had expanded. At 0200 by my watch, I noticed condensation forming on the inside of the windows, even though the temperature had not changed. Each time I stopped moving long enough to wipe the glass, the ticking sped up again. I stopped trying. The clock began to do something else then. It started anticipating me. Before I fully stopped moving, before my muscles had even relaxed, the ticking would quicken slightly, as if it knew I was about to slow down. When I forced myself to move again, it would correct itself. The sense of being watched intensified, not from the direction, but from the concept of time itself. At 02:37, I stumbled. Just a misstep. My knee buckled and I caught myself against the desk. In that fraction of a second of stillness, the ticking surged so violently that the clock emitted a sharp cracking sound. A hairline fracture appeared across the glass face. I screamed. The sound came out hoarse, raw, but it worked. The ticking snapped back to normal, and the crack stopped spreading. I understood then that this was no longer a question of endurance. Something was using the clock as an instrument, a way to measure my presence, my resistance. If I stopped, if I allowed myself to be still for too long, I would lose something I could not get back. Time was not passing. It was being taken. By 0300 I could barely stand. My vision swam. My thoughts looped. I knew I was approaching a limit, and whatever governed that clock knew it too. The ticking had grown louder overall, even at its slowest, as if it were counting down to a moment only it understood. I am ending this part of the account here, because what happened next involved an attempt to escape the outpost itself, a decision that went against every protocol I was trained to follow. I made it because staying meant failing, and failing meant something far worse than being lost in the dark. Morning did not feel close. It felt like something I was being raced toward. I opened the door at 03:12 by my watch and immediately regretted it. The cold hit me like a physical force, sharp enough to cut through the fog in my head. I stepped outside anyway, because the ticking had reached a volume that felt dangerous, not to my ears but to my sense of self. Inside the outpost, time was accelerating away from me. Outside, I hoped, it might at least be neutral. The forest was unnaturally still. My headlamp cut a narrow tunnel through the darkness, illuminating bark, needles, rocks. All perfectly ordinary, and yet somehow staged, like a backdrop waiting for me to do something wrong. I kept moving, walking down the access road at a steady pace, forcing my legs to cooperate. The ticking followed me. That is not a metaphor. I could still hear it, faint but distinct, carried on the air behind me. Each time I slowed, the sound grew sharper, closer. When I picked up my pace, it receded. I did not look back. At 03:26, my watch vibrated weakly, the battery already draining. I glanced at it while walking. The seconds were still moving normally. That small consistency felt like a lifeline. I spoke out loud, narrating my actions, describing the trees, the road, the sound of my boots. Each word steadied the rhythm behind me, keeping it from surging. I realized then that the clock did not need the outpost anymore. It had learned my boundaries. It knew how to measure me. The access road curved downhill, away from the structure. Fog began to roll in from the low ground, thin at first, then thicker, swallowing the beam of my headlamp after only a few feet. I continued anyway. Stopping was not an option. Stillness felt like an open invitation. At 03:41, exhaustion caught up with me. My breathing became ragged. My legs trembled. I stumbled again, this time falling to one knee. The ticking roared in response, so loud and sudden that it felt like a physical blow. I screamed, not in fear but in defiance. Forcing myself upright, shouting nonsense if I had to, just to keep sound in the air. The ticking pulled back, sulking, waiting. I understood then what the real danger was. It was not death. It was erasure. If I stopped long enough, time would continue without me, leaving me behind like an abandoned object, present but no longer participating. I would still exist, but not move forward. A permanent still frame. At 04:02, I reached a point on the road where the fog thinned slightly. Dawn should have been approaching, but the sky remained pitch black. My watch read 04:07:03. I checked it repeatedly, tapping the face, turning my wrist, making sure it was real. The ticking behind me grew impatient. Faster now even when I walked, as if it sensed the approaching limit of my endurance. I made a decision I had been avoiding. I turned around. The outpost stood where it always had, silhouetted against the trees, but something about it was wrong. The windows glowed faintly, not with light, but with motion. I could see the shadow of the clock hand spinning wildly against the glass, as if the entire building had become its casing. I did not approach. Instead, I began to walk sideways, keeping the structure in my peripheral vision, never stopping, never facing it directly. The ticking screamed in protest, surging so fast it became a continuous sound, like rushing water. At 04:17, my watch froze. The second hand stopped between ticks. I shook my wrist, tapped the face. Nothing. The ticking behind me reached a peak I can only describe as triumphant. I felt pressure in my head, behind my eyes, as if something were trying to pull me inward, compress me into a single moment. I ran. I ran down the road, lungs burning, vision narrowing, sound tearing past me. The ticking chased me, no longer trailing but surrounding, coming from everywhere at once. Each step felt heavier, like wading through deep water. My thoughts began to fragment, images repeated. The idea of stopping grew seductive, almost comforting. At 04:29, I collapsed. I do not know how long I was down. I do know that I did not lose consciousness. I lay on my side in the dirt, chest heaving, unable to move. The ticking slowed, became deliberate, measured. I felt it pressing in, aligning itself with my breathing, my heartbeat, waiting for me to give up. I whispered, then shouted, then screamed. Anything to make sound. Anything to prove I was still active, still resisting. The fog above me began to glow faintly. Not with light, but with the promise of it. The ticking faltered. For the first time, it sounded uncertain. I forced myself to roll onto my back and kick my legs, flail my arms, laugh hysterically, cry, cough, anything that counted as motion. The sound broke apart, fragmenting into uneven bursts. The pressure eased. At 05:02, the sky began to lighten. It was subtle at first, a thinning of darkness rather than true dawn. But it was enough. The ticking recoiled, shrinking, fading, retreating back toward the outpost. I stayed where I was, crawling in slow, exaggerated movements, never allowing my body to fully rest until the light strengthened. When the sun finally crested the ridge at So Sips the Weven, the ticking stopped completely. I lay there for several minutes, shaking, staring at the sky, afraid that if I moved the wrong way it would start again. When I finally stood, the world felt heavy but real. Time flowed normally. Pain returned in manageable waves. My watch remained frozen, useless, but my phone powered on long enough to show the correct date and time before dying. Search and rescue found me at Zo 7s and 34, less than a mile from the outpost. I was dehydrated, exhausted, but otherwise unharmed. They asked why I had left my post. I told them the truth, and they wrote down something else. The outpost clock was recovered later that morning. It was still ticking when they found it. The glass face was shattered, the hands bent, but the mechanism functioned perfectly. It stopped the moment it was removed from the building. The official report lists equipment malfunction and fatigue-induced disorientation. I signed it. I returned to duty 3 weeks later. I no longer wear a watch. I avoid sitting still for too long. And sometimes, late at night, when everything is quiet and I pause without thinking, I feel that familiar pressure, like time leaning forward, waiting to see if I will let it pass without me. I do not intend to give it that satisfaction. My name is Ian Mercer. I am employed as a seasonal field technician assigned to a remote forest outpost. And on the night this happened, I was the only person scheduled to remain on site. I state that plainly because everything that followed can be traced back to that single fact. There was no partner, no overlapping shift, no late arrival written into the log. I signed in at 1840, completed the equipment inventory by 19:15, and locked the exterior door at 19:22. From that moment until dawn, I was alone. The bunk room was a narrow rectangle of unfinished timber, built to house 4 people during peak season, but now stripped down to the essentials. 2 metal bunks remained bolted to the floor on opposite walls. I took the one closest to the door out of habit. The bunk across from mine stayed empty, its mattress still wrapped in the same gray cover. It had worn all season, the pillow squared and untouched. I remember noticing that because I prefer symmetry, and the empty bed gave the room a lopsided feel. The outpost itself was quiet in the way remote structures are quiet, never fully silent, always settling, breathing, reacting to the environment. The wind moved through the trees in low, patient waves. Somewhere beyond the ridge, water moved over stone. The generator had been shut down for the night, leaving only the battery, backed lights humming faintly through the walls. It was an ordinary night by any reasonable standard. I finished my reports at the small desk, bolted to the wall outside the bunk room, brushed my teeth in the utility sink, and returned to the room shortly after 2200. I changed, climbed into my bunk, and turned off the lantern mounted above my head. The darkness was immediate but familiar, the shapes of the room already memorized by weeks of use. The first sound came less than 10 minutes later. It was a creak, low and deliberate, the kind of sound metal makes when weight shifts against it. I recognized it instantly because I had heard it before, dozens of times, during earlier rotations when the bunk room was full. It was the sound of someone rolling over, the frame flexing slightly under a change in pressure. I waited for the follow-up sound that usually comes with it, the rustle of fabric or the faint exhale of breath. Nothing followed. The room settled again, returning to its steady background noise. I told myself what anyone would tell themselves. Temperature change. The wood cooling. The metal frame contracting. It made sense, and I accepted it without argument. Then it happened again. This time the creak was longer, drawn out, as if whatever caused it took its time shifting from one position to another. The sound came from the bunk across from mine, the empty one. I opened my eyes, staring into the darkness, and held my breath without realizing I had done it. I reached for my watch and checked the time by feel. 22:27. I lay still, listening. My own bunk did not move. The floor did not respond with sympathetic vibration. Only that single bed produced sound, followed by a faint, almost inaudible settling, like weight redistributing itself carefully. I sat up and reached for the lantern switch. The light snapped on, harsh and immediate. The bunk across from mine was exactly as I had left it. The mattress cover lay smooth. The pillow was undisturbed. No sag. No depression, no sign that anything had touched it. I swung my legs off the bed and crossed the narrow room, pressing my hand flat against the mattress. It was cool. Completely cold. I checked the floor beneath it, then the wall behind it, then the ceiling above. Nothing was loose. Nothing appeared damaged or stressed. I stood there longer than necessary, letting the light remain on, waiting for the sound to repeat. It didn't. Eventually, I turned the lantern off and returned to my bunk. The third creak came sometime after 2300. I didn't check the exact minute, because by then I already knew what I would see if I did. The sound was unmistakable now, accompanied by a faint metallic tick at the end, like a spring finding its resting point. It was followed by another, softer creak, as if the weight adjusted itself again, trying to get comfortable. That thought came uninvited, and I rejected it immediately. Objects don't get comfortable. They don't shift twice for no reason. I stayed still, forcing myself not to react. I listened to the rhythm of the sounds as they continued intermittently. A creak. A pause. Another creak, slightly different in pitch. Each one suggested intent, not randomness. Each one suggested patience. Sometime after midnight, I realized the pattern matched something heard many times before without thinking about it. It matched the way people move when they are trying not to wake someone else. Small adjustments, careful shifts, the avoidance of sudden noise. That realization tightened something in my chest that did not loosen again. I turned the lantern on once more. Again, the bed was empty. Again, the mattress showed no sign of use. I ran my hands along the frame, checking each bolt, each joint. Everything was solid. I crouched to look underneath half, expecting to find some explanation hiding in shadow. There was nothing there but dust, and an old steer blanket folded neatly against the wall. I stood up too quickly and struck my head lightly against the frame, the dull pain grounding me for a moment. I welcomed it. Pain made things simpler. I considered leaving the bunk room entirely and sleeping in the main area, but that felt like a concession I wasn't ready to make. I had done nothing wrong. I wasn't afraid of a sound I couldn't yet explain. At least, that's what I told myself. I lay back down and left the lantern on. The creaking continued anyway. It happened less frequently now, but with more purpose. Each sound was heavier than the last, the metal complaining as if under sustained pressure. I watched the empty bunk closely, waiting for something visible to change. It never did. The bed did not dip. The mattress did not compress. And yet the sound insisted on the presence of weight. At Vol.50, I heard something new. It was a soft, almost imperceptible exhale. It did not come from the doorway, or the walls or the window. It came from the space above the empty mattress, low and controlled. The sound someone makes when they finally settle after too much movement. I sat up fully, my back against the wall. My eyes fixed on the opposite bunk. I spoke out loud then, my voice steady despite the tension in my throat. I said there was no one else scheduled for the night. I said the outpost was locked. I said I was alone. The creaking stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise had been. It felt deliberate, like a response. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, watching that bunk, listening to the forest outside, counting my breaths to keep my hands from shaking. Nothing else happened before dawn, but I did not sleep again, not even for a moment. When the light finally crept through the small window and the shapes of the room softened into familiarity, I stood and inspected the bunk one last time. This time, the mattress was warm. I did not log the warmth of the mattress right away. That omission matters more than I would like to admit. When dawn reached the window, thin and gray, my priority was procedural normalcy. I told myself fatigue could manufacture sensations, that heat lingers in enclosed spaces, that a hand pressed too long can convince itself of anything. I wrote down weather observations, checked the perimeter seal, and stepped outside to breathe air that felt clean and impartial. The forest looked unchanged. The ground was damp from overnight condensation. Needles darkened, rocks slick. There were no footprints around the outpost that did not belong to me. No disturbed soil. No broken branches. I circled the structure twice, testing the door seals, the window latches, the storage shed padlock. Everything remained intact. I returned inside and closed the door with more care than necessary. Only then did I go back to the bunk room. The warmth was still there. It wasn't diffuse or imagined. It had a boundary. The center of the mattress retained heat in a shape that suggested a torso lying lengthwise, not sprawled, not diagonal. I placed both hands flat and waited. The warmth did not dissipate quickly. It bled outward slowly, like a body cooling after rest. I checked the thermometer mounted on the wall. The interior temperature had dropped overnight and was only beginning to rise with the morning light. There was no mechanical explanation for localized heat retention. I pressed my ear to the mattress, listening for the faint creak of settling foam or springs. Nothing responded. I lifted the mattress. The underside was cold. The metal frame beneath it was cold. The blanket folded under the bunk was cold. The warmth existed only on the sleeping surface and nowhere else, like a residue that had not yet decided to leave. I replaced the mattress carefully and stood there longer than necessary, breathing through my nose, counting seconds. I told myself I would document this after breakfast. That hunger and dehydration could distort perception. I stepped away and made coffee that tasted thinner than usual. My hands shook just enough that I noticed. At 07:30, the radio check-in window opened. I reported routine status. I did not mention the night. I did not mention the bunk. My voice sounded normal in my own ears, and that felt like a small victory. By mid-morning, the warmth had faded. The mattress was uniformly cool. If I had waited to check it, there would have been nothing to report. That fact bothered me more than if the heat had lingered all day. I spent the next hours completing maintenance, tasks that required movement and attention. I tightened loose screws, swept dust from vents, inventoried supplies. I avoided the bunk room except when necessary. When I did pass through, I did not look directly at the empty bed. Avoidance can be a strategy as much as confrontation. Around noon, I found the first inconsistency in the logbook. The outpost maintains 2 records: the official digital report submitted during check-ins and a handwritten log kept on site for redundancy. I opened the log to note generator inspection times and saw an entry written beneath my previous night's sign-off. The handwriting was neat, printed, and aligned with the ruled lines. The ink was the same brand we use, black gel, identical thickness. The entry recorded a time I had not been awake to write anything. Once in 42. Below it, a single sentence. Occupant adjusted position. There was no name, no initials, no explanation. I felt the room narrow, not physically, but in the way attention tightens when options reduce. I flipped back through the log. No other anomalies appeared. No jokes. No smudges. The paper did not show indentations from previous writing that could have transferred accidentally. The entry stood alone. I considered the possibility that I had written it and forgotten. Sleepwalking is documented. Fatigue does strange things. I pressed my thumb against the ink. It was dry, completely set. If I had written it, I would remember the pen in my hand, the sound of paper beneath it. I remembered nothing like that. I crossed out the entry with a single line and initialed beside it, noting, unverified. That felt appropriate. It did not make me feel better. The afternoon passed without incident. The forest held its shape. The radio remained silent outside scheduled windows. I ate without appetite and kept myself busy until the light began to angle low again. The knowledge that night would return pressed at the edges of every thought. I told myself I would sleep in the main room, if necessary. That changing locations was a reasonable response to uncertainty. At 1840, I locked the exterior door again. I moved my bedding into the main area and set up the cot near the desk. I left the bunk room light on and the door open. A decision driven more by spite than logic. If something wanted the darkness, I would not give it willingly. The first sound came before full dark. It was not a creak this time. It was the softest possible friction, fabric against fabric, the whisper of material brushing itself. I froze, one hand still on the lantern switch above the cot. The sound came from the bunk room, from the direction of the empty bed. I did not turn the light off. I did not turn it on. I stayed exactly where I was and listened. The sound repeated, slightly longer, like a blanket being adjusted by careful hands. Then came the creak, the familiar complaint of metal under weight, followed by the subtle tick of a frame finding balance. I stood slowly and stepped into the bunk room. The empty bed was no longer empty. The mattress was indented. Not dramatically, not enough to see from across the room, unless you were looking for it. but enough that the cover pulled slightly toward the center. The pillow was no longer squared. Its corner dipped inward, as if pressed by a cheek that had since lifted. There was nothing visible occupying the space. No outline. No shadow inconsistent with the light. Just absence shaped like presence. I spoke again, my voice quieter this time. I stated my name. I stated the date. I stated that there should be no one else there. The words felt thin in the air, like they lacked weight. The indentation deepened. It happened slowly, deliberately, the mattress compressing another inch, as if someone shifted onto their side. The frame responded with a muted creak. The pillow sank further, folding slightly under invisible pressure. I stepped back until my shoulders touched the wall. I did not run. I did not shout. I watched. Because watching was the only thing left that felt like control. The indentation adjusted again, smaller this time, like someone finally finding a position that worked. The sound ceased. The bed settled into stillness. I realized then that the sounds from the night before had not been random. They had been preparatory. Someone learning the bed. Someone testing how much movement it could tolerate without drawing attention. I backed out of the room and closed the door. I wedged a chair beneath the handle, a useless gesture that nonetheless occupied my hands. I returned to the cot and sat with my back against the desk, lantern on full brightness, radio within reach. From behind the closed door, I heard a slow, contented exhale. It was followed by nothing else. I did not open that door again that night. I stayed awake, listening to the building settle, to the forest breathe. No footsteps approached. No voices spoke. The chair never shifted. When morning came, I opened the door. The bunk room was empty, and bed lay smooth and untouched, cool to the hand. The logbook on the desk held a new entry, written beneath my crossed-out note in the same neat print. Yo Tuhido 6. Occupant resting. I waited until full daylight before I moved from the cot. The lantern had burned through half its charge by then, and my eyes ached from holding the same fixed distance all night. When I finally stood, my legs protested as if I had been crouched instead of seated. I welcomed the stiffness. It proved that time had passed normally, that I had not lost hours without knowing. The chair I had wedged beneath the bunkroom handle remained in place. I lifted it away carefully, listening for any sound from inside. There was none. The forest outside had resumed its ordinary morning activity. Birds calling in irregular bursts, wind threading through branches. That normality felt rehearsed, like a stage reset too quickly after a scene change. I opened the bunkroom door. The room looked exactly as it should have. Both bunks stood empty. The mattress across from mine lay flat and undisturbed, the gray cover smooth. The pillow squared again as if someone had taken the time to correct it. I stepped inside and stood beside the bed, staring at the place where the indentation had formed the night before. The mattress was cold. I pressed down with both hands, mimicking the shape I had seen, and felt only resistance. No lingering warmth. No sense of displacement. The bed made no sound beyond the expected creak of pressure applied openly, honestly. I let go and the mattress sprang back into place. On the desk outside the room, the logbook lay open. I had not touched it since the previous night. The new entry remained where I had seen it, the ink dry, the handwriting unchanged. I read it again, slower this time, searching for some hidden indication of intent or error. 02706. Occupant resting. I closed the book and did not reopen it. At 0730, the radio crackled to life for the scheduled check-in. I reported status as operational. My voice wavered only slightly, and I corrected it before the other end could respond. No questions followed. The line went quiet again, leaving me alone with the hum of the building and the memory of an absence that had weight. I made the decision to leave before I fully articulated it to myself. The rotation allowed for early departure, hint of equipment failure or safety concerns. I did not know how to explain what had happened in a way that would fit the form, but I knew that staying another night was not an option I could reasonably justify. I packed efficiently, bedding first, personal items next. I avoided looking directly at the bunk across from mine, but I was aware of it in the way one is aware of a closed door behind them. I checked the windows, shut off unnecessary systems, and completed the final walk through with a thoroughness that bordered on ritual. Before locking the door, I paused in the bunk room one last time. I stood between the two beds, my own and the one across from it, and listened. The room was silent. No settling, no creaking, no suggestion of movement. I told myself that if nothing happened now, nothing would follow me. That whatever had occurred was bound to the structure, to the specific geometry of that space. I locked the door and left the key in the lockbox. The hike out took longer than usual. Not because the trail had changed, but because I stopped more often, listening behind me, checking my surroundings with an attention that bordered on compulsion. Nothing followed. The forest remained indifferent, offering no sign that anything had noticed my departure. When I reached the access point, the relief I expected did not come. Instead, I felt a thinning, like pressure released too quickly. I drove without turning on the radio. The sound of tires on gravel grounding me more than music could have. I submitted my report that afternoon. I wrote that I experienced sleep disruption due to unexplained structural noise. I recommended a maintenance inspection of the bunk, frames and logbook procedures. I did not mention warmth. I did not mention indentations. I did not mention breathing. The response came 2 days later. The maintenance team reported no issues with the bunks. The frames were secure. No abnormal wear. No environmental factors that could produce the reported sounds. The logbook discrepancy was attributed to user error, possibly fatigue related. The case was closed. I told myself that should have been the end of it. It wasn't. 3 weeks later, I received an automated notification from the scheduling system. My next rotation had been reassigned. Not to the same outpost, but to another facility in a different section of the forest. The change was routine, the message said, made to balance staffing needs. I opened the attachment out of idle curiosity. The bunkroom layout diagram was included. 2 metal bunks, opposite walls. 4-person capacity, currently reduced. The configuration was identical. I closed the file and sat very still. That night, in my own apartment, I lay awake longer than usual. The bed beneath me was familiar, the sounds of the building known and predictable. I listened anyway, counting the shifts of my own weight, the quiet responses of springs and frame. Just after midnight, the mattress beside me creaked. Not the floor. Not the wall. The bed. It was the sound of weight adjusting carefully, of someone making room without asking for it. I held my breath and did not move. I stared at the empty space beside me, at the unmarked sheet, at the pillow that had not yet dipped. The sound came again, softer this time, followed by a long, controlled exhale. I did not turn on the light. I did not speak. I lay still and understood, finally, what the logbook entry had meant. It had never been documenting a mistake. It had been a routine update. Occupant resting. My name is Victor Lane. I am recording this because accuracy matters, and because the order of events matters even more. I have learned that when things stop making sense, the only defense left is to describe them exactly as they happened, without exaggeration and without omission. What follows occurred over the course of a single day, during a routine assignment that, at the time, I believed would be uneventful. I have worked as a field technician for the Regional Utilities Authority for almost 8 years. My job involves maintaining and auditing remote monitoring stations, small self-contained outposts that track water pressure, seismic vibration, and signal relay across protected forest land. These stations are unmanned. They are designed to be visited by a single technician at scheduled intervals, usually once every few weeks, sometimes less. The work is solitary, procedural, and quiet. That is one of the reasons I took the job. The station assigned to me that morning was designated Relay Point K-17. I had serviced it before. It sat at the edge of a long service road, surrounded by dense pine forest, far enough from public trails that hikers rarely passed nearby. There was no cell service. Communication was handled through a hardline. Radio console inside the station, connected to a central hub 40 miles away. I arrived shortly after sunrise. The weather was stable. Clear sky, cool air, no wind. I remember this because nothing about the environment felt wrong. There were no unusual sounds, no sense of being watched, no inexplicable tension. The forest was still in the way forests are in the early morning, as if everything is holding its breath. I unlocked the station, logged my arrival time, and began the inspection checklist. Power supply nominal. Battery backup at full capacity. No exterior damage. Interior clean. Dust levels consistent with the last visit. I moved through the routine without thinking about it. That is important. I was calm. I was alert. I was not afraid. The audio recorder was the last item on the checklist. Each station is equipped with a continuous, loop audio logging system. Its purpose is simple: to record environmental noise inside and immediately outside the structure. The data is rarely used. Most of the time it captures nothing but wind, rain, the occasional animal brushing against the exterior wall. Once a month, technicians are required to check the recordings to ensure the system is functioning. I sat down at the console, inserted my access key, and selected the most recent log segment. At first, I heard nothing but static and low ambient noise. The hum of the generator. A faint, distant rustling that could have been branches or small animals. I let it play while I filled out the corresponding line on the inspection form. Then I heard my own voice. Not immediately. There was a brief pause, no more than a second, where the ambient noise dropped out entirely. The silence was absolute, as if the microphone had been submerged or disconnected. Then the voice began. It was me. I know how that sounds, but there was no ambiguity. It was my voice exactly as it sounds on official recordings. Same pitch, same cadence. Same faint rasp from an old throat injury. I recognized it the way you recognize your own reflection without thinking. The voice was screaming, not speaking, not shouting. Screaming with raw, uncontrolled panic. There were no words at first, just the sound of someone in extreme distress. Lungs pulling in air too fast, throat straining to produce noise. I froze with my hand still resting on the console. The scream cut off abruptly, replaced by heavy breathing. Then my voice spoke. "This isn't on the schedule," it said. "I haven't worked this shift yet." I stopped the playback. For several seconds, I sat there staring at the console display. My first thought was that the system had pulled an old file by mistake, that I was listening to corrupted data or a mislabeled recording from another station. That explanation did not hold up for long. The timestamp on the file was dated 3 hours in the future. I checked it again, then again. The recorder was set to local time, synced automatically through the hardline connection. The system had not malfunctioned. According to every indicator available to me, the audio had been recorded later that same day. I did not panic. I want that to be clear. I felt unsettled, yes, but not afraid. Fear implies belief, and at that moment, I did not believe what I was seeing. I assumed there was an error I had not yet identified. I documented the anomaly in the log, flagged it for follow-up, and moved on. That was the professional response. That was what I had been trained to do. I completed the rest of the inspection and secured the station. By the time I locked the door behind me, the sun was higher in the sky and the forest looked exactly as it should. Normal, predictable, unthreatening. On the drive back toward the service hub, I kept thinking about the sentence I had heard. I haven't worked this shift yet. The phrasing bothered me. It was specific, contextual. It implied awareness not just of time, but of assignment schedules, of procedural expectations. Those were not details that would appear in random interference or audio bleed. When I reached the hub, I reported the incident to my supervisor. He listened to the clip once, frowned, and then listened again. He did not say much. He asked if I was certain the voice was mine. I told him yes. He asked if I remembered recording it. I told him no. After a brief discussion, he concluded that the file must be the result of a synchronization error. He told me the system sometimes cached data incorrectly when the connection lagged. He assured me it would be investigated. Before I left his office, he added something that struck me as odd. "Your next assignment," he said, checking his screen, "is an overnight diagnostic at K17. Tonight." I told him that wasn't possible. The schedule showed no such shift. He turned the screen so I could see it. There it was. My name, Victor Lane, assigned technician. Start time the 900 p.m. The date was correct. Today. I remember standing there, feeling a slow, cold pressure settle behind my eyes. Not fear yet, something else. A creeping awareness that the day was not finished with me. I asked him when the assignment had been added. He shrugged. "It's been there all week." I did not argue. I left the office with the printed work order folded in my pocket. The words from the recording looping in my head, whether I wanted them to or not. I haven't worked this shift yet. As the afternoon passed, I tried to distract myself. I ran errands. I cleaned my apartment. I avoided thinking about the station, the recorder, the timestamp. But every so often, without warning, I would hear the scream again in my mind. Raw, desperate, unmistakably mine. At 8:30 p.m., I got into my truck and started the drive back toward relay point K17. The sun was already setting, the forest darkening into shapes and shadows. The road ahead was empty. The radio played softly, a familiar voice delivering the weather forecast in a calm, neutral tone. I turned it off. I wanted silence. I arrived at relay point K17 exactly 8:57 p.m. The sky had darkened faster than I expected, the last trace of dusk dissolving into a heavy, lightless blue. My headlights cut a narrow, tunnel through the trees as I pulled off the service road and parked in front of the station. The building looked unchanged from the morning. Same weathered siding, same reinforced door, same small observation window, reflecting my own headlights back at me. I sat in the truck longer than necessary, engine idling, listening to the ticking sound it made as it cooled unevenly. This was not hesitation born of fear. It was habit. Overnight diagnostics required a certain mindset, a deliberate slowing down, a willingness to stay alert for long stretches, with nothing to occupy the mind except routine. I unlocked the station and stepped inside. The interior lights flickered once before stabilizing. The air smelled faintly of dust and cold metal. Everything was exactly where I had left it that morning. Clipboard on the desk. Console dark but powered. Chair pushed in. No sign that anyone, or anything, had entered since I locked the door. I logged my arrival time, 9:01 p.m. The overnight diagnostic checklist was longer than the daytime inspection. It involved periodic system stress tests, manual recalibration, and continuous monitoring of the audio and vibration sensors. Most of it consisted of waiting. That was the part people underestimated. It is easy to stay calm when you are busy. It is much harder when there is nothing to do but listen. By 9:30 p.m., the first set of diagnostics was complete. All readings were normal. No anomalies. No unexplained fluctuations. The forest outside remained quiet, interrupted only by the occasional distant call of an animal I could not identify with certainty. At 10:00 p.m., I initiated the audio monitor. The system allowed for live playback as well as recorded review. I hesitated before activating it, my hand hovering over the switch longer than necessary. Then I reminded myself that avoiding data does not change data, and flipped it on. At first, there was nothing but the low hiss of static and the faint ambient sounds I expected. Wind brushing against the structure. Something moving slowly through undergrowth several yards away. My own breathing, barely audible. I focused on the checklist, forcing myself not to stare at the waveform display. At 10:18 p.m., the audio feed spiked. The sound that came through the speakers was not loud. That was what unsettled me. It was close, so close that it felt intimate, invasive. The unmistakable sound of someone exhaling, just inches from the microphone. I stood up so quickly that the chair scraped loudly against the floor. The breathing continued, steady and deliberate, as if whoever, or whatever, was producing it was aware of being heard and was unconcerned. "Hello," I said, immediately regretting it. My voice echoed faintly through the station. The breathing stopped. I waited. Seconds stretched. The silence that followed was thicker than the noise had been, pressing in on my ears, until I felt an urge to fill it with anything, even static. Then the breathing returned. It was synchronized with mine. I became acutely aware of every inhale, every exhale, every involuntary hitch in my chest. The sound from the speaker mirrored it perfectly, matching rhythm and depth with unsettling precision. I shut off the audio feed. The sudden absence of sound left my ears ringing. I stood there, heart pounding, now despite my efforts to remain calm. Staring at the silent console, I told myself there was an explanation. Feedback loop. Equipment malfunction. A delay in the system that created the illusion of synchronization. I documented the incident. That is what I did instead of panicking. I wrote it down in precise, neutral language, as if words could anchor the experience to something manageable. At 11:00 p.m., I conducted the exterior perimeter check. The station was equipped with floodlights, that illuminated a wide radius around the building. I stepped outside, the cold night air biting at my face, and scanned the tree line. Nothing moved. No footprints. No broken branches. No signs of recent disturbance. The ground was dry and firm, marked only by my own tire tracks from earlier that evening. I returned inside and locked the door behind me. Shortly after midnight, the radio crackled to life. This was unusual but not unheard of. The central hub occasionally performed signal checks during overnight hours. I reached for the microphone, ready to respond, but froze when I heard my name. "Victor Lane," the voice said. It was not my supervisor. It was not anyone I recognized. The voice was flat, devoid of inflection, as if reading from a script without understanding the meaning of the words. "This channel is not scheduled for outbound communication," I replied, forcing my voice to remain steady. "Please identify yourself." There was a pause. Then the voice spoke again. "You have already identified yourself." My mouth went dry. "That's not how this works," I said. "If this is a test." "You discovered the audio log early." The voice interrupted. That was not anticipated. I stared at the radio, a cold realization settling over me. "Who is this?" I asked. Another pause. Longer this time. "This transmission is a courtesy," the voice said. "The recording will be clearer tonight." The radio went silent. I sat down heavily, the words echoing in my head. The recording will be clearer tonight. I did not need to ask which recording it meant. The scream. The future timestamp. The voice that knew I had not yet worked the shift. At 12:38 a.m., the station lights flickered again. This time, they did not immediately stabilize. They dimmed, surged, then dimmed once more. The generator indicator dropped briefly before returning to normal. The batteries kicked in seamlessly, but the interruption had broken the illusion of control I had been clinging to. I checked the audio recorder. A new file had appeared. The timestamp was current. I stared at it for a long time before pressing play. The first sound was silence. Then, faintly, my own voice speaking in a low, controlled tone. "This is Victor Lane," it said. "If you're hearing this, you already know something is wrong." My hands trembled as I listened. The recording continued, my voice describing the station, the time, the sense of being observed. It matched my thoughts with unsettling accuracy, recounting moments that had already occurred and others that had not yet happened. Then the voice faltered. There was a sharp intake of breath, followed by the sound of movement. Rapid footsteps, the scrape of something heavy being dragged across the floor. "I can hear it," my recorded voice said. "It's standing right outside the door." I was standing inside the station, staring at the reinforced door. There was nothing on the other side. No sound. No shadow beneath the frame. The recording ended abruptly. I did not move for a long time. I could not reconcile what I had heard with what I was experiencing. The logical part of my mind searched desperately for explanations, but every possibility collapsed under the weight of the evidence accumulating around me. At 1:12 a.m., there was a knock at the door. It was slow, deliberate, 3 measured impacts evenly spaced. I did not respond. The knock came again. 3 more. Then my own voice spoke from the other side. "Victor," it said softly. "Open the door. You're running out of time." I backed away, every instinct screaming at me not to move closer. My heart hammered so hard it felt like it might fracture my ribs. The voice outside sighed. "This would be easier if you followed the recording." I looked at the console. at the audio files lining the screen like a list of future memories waiting to be claimed. I understood then, with terrifying clarity, that the recordings were not predictions. They were instructions. And somewhere between the beginning of the shift and its end, I was supposed to become the voice screaming on that tape. I stood in the center of the station, the knock still echoing in my ears long after it stopped. The door did not rattle. There was no attempt to force entry. Whatever was on the other side understood patience. It understood sequence. I checked the time. 1:14 a.m. The overnight diagnostic shift ended at 6:00 a.m. I told myself to stay inside. The station was reinforced for wildlife encounters. The door was solid steel, bolted into a concrete frame. Nothing short of heavy equipment could breach it. If I stayed where I was, followed protocol, waited out the shift, I would leave in the morning and report everything. That was the plan. That had to be the plan. The radio clicked once, softly like a throat being cleared. "You are deviating," the voice said. I did not respond. I pulled the chair closer to the console and sat, forcing my body into stillness. My hands were shaking badly now. There was no point pretending otherwise. The fear had arrived, full and undeniable, but I refused to let it dictate my actions. The audio recorder chimed. Another file had been added. I closed my eyes. For a moment, I considered not listening. I understood what the recordings were doing. They were narrowing the path in front of me, reducing possibility until only one outcome remained. But I also knew that ignorance would not protect me. The recordings existed whether I heard them or not. I pressed play. The sound was distorted at first, as if the microphone had been struck or partially obstructed. Then my voice came through, strained but controlled. "I'm trying to change it," it said. "If I don't follow what it wants, maybe." The recording cut to a sudden crash. Metal against metal, followed by a sharp cry of pain. I flinched, instinctively clutching my side as if I had been struck. The voice returned. Closer to the microphone now, breathless. "It knows when I don't listen. It adjusts." The file ended. I opened my eyes and scanned the room. Everything was still. No movement. No sound beyond the quiet hum of the generator. I was uninjured. Whatever had happened in the recording had not yet happened to me. Yet, at 2:03 a.m., the vibration sensors triggered briefly. The console displayed a localized disturbance, just outside the station's perimeter, near the rear wall. The reading lasted less than a second, then vanished. I pulled up the camera feed for that angle. The image showed nothing but darkness and the faint outline of trees beyond the floodlight's reach. I told myself not to look for patterns, but they forced themselves on me anyway. The disturbances were getting closer in time to the present. The recordings were becoming more detailed, more specific. The gap between cause and effect was shrinking. At 2:41 a.m., the power flickered again. This time, the lights went out completely. The station fell into darkness so sudden and complete that it stole my breath. I stood up, heart racing, hands reaching blindly until I felt the edge of the desk. Emergency lighting kicked in seconds later, bathing the room in a dull red glow. The generator indicator was steady. The batteries were engaged. The outage should not have happened. The radio came alive immediately. "You are nearly aligned," the voice said. "Stop," I whispered. My throat felt tight raw. "What do you want from me?" There was a pause, longer than before. "We want the record to be accurate," the voice replied. The implication settled over me slowly, horrifying in its simplicity. This was not about harming me. Not exactly. It was about completion. About ensuring that what had been recorded would, in fact, occur. I glanced at the console, at the list of audio files, at the first one I had heard that morning, stamped with a time that had not yet existed. The scream. At 30:19 a.m., the knock returned. This time, it was not at the door. It came from inside the station. 3 slow knocks sounded from the far wall, near the equipment storage locker. I spun toward the sound, my heart slamming against my ribs. The locker door was closed, secured with a heavy latch. Another 3 knocks. The metal vibrated slightly under the impact. I backed away, pressing myself against the opposite wall. My mind raced, grasping for any rational explanation that could keep me grounded. Thermal expansion, structural stress, anything. The locker latch began to rattle. I reached for the emergency crowbar mounted beside the door, my fingers fumbling before closing around the cold metal. I did not know what I intended to do with it. I only knew I needed something solid in my hands. The rattling stopped. The station fell silent again. The audio recorder chimed. I did not want to listen. I knew what it would contain. But my body moved without conscious decision, my hand pressing play as if guided by something outside my control. The recording began with heavy breathing. My breathing, labored, uneven, edged with pain. I tried to keep it locked. My recorded voice said, "That was a mistake." There was a wet sound, like something dragging across the floor. "I think it needs me to hear it." The voice continued, "To understand why it has to happen this way." The scream came then. It was worse than I remembered. Louder. Closer. A sound torn from deep inside the chest, raw and unrestrained, filled with terror and agony. I dropped the crowbar, clamping my hands over my ears. But the sound seemed to come from inside my head, bypassing my senses entirely. When the scream ended, the recording cut off. I slid down the wall until I was sitting on the floor, shaking uncontrollably. Tears blurred my vision, though I did not remember deciding to cry. I felt small, trapped inside a mechanism that did not care about my resistance. At 4:02 a.m., the locker door creaked open. I watched it happen in the reflection of the console screen, too afraid to turn around. The door opened slowly, inch by inch, revealing only darkness within. No hand emerged. No shape stepped out. Just empty space that seemed deeper than the locker itself could possibly be. The radio spoke again. "This is the point of divergence," the voice said. "If you do not proceed, the record will be incomplete." I understood then that there was a choice, but it was not the kind people imagine when they talk about free will. I could refuse, stay frozen, and let whatever correction followed take its course. Or I could move forward, follow the sequence, and ensure that what happened was at least documented truthfully. Accuracy matters. That was what I had said at the beginning. At 4:27 a.m., I began recording a new audio log manually. "My name is Victor Lane," I said, my voice trembling but audible. "This recording is being made during overnight diagnostic shift at relay point K17. I believe the system has been documenting events before they occur." I described everything. The sounds, the voice, the locker, the sense of being guided. As I spoke, a strange calm settled over me. Not acceptance exactly, but clarity. If this was going to happen, it would happen with or without my cooperation. At least this way, there would be a record. At 5:11 a.m., the station door unlocked itself. I did not touch the console. I did not move. The lock disengaged with a soft mechanical click, followed by the slow creak of the door opening. Cold air rushed in. Footsteps crossed the threshold. They were heavy, deliberate, matching the rhythm I had heard in the earlier recordings. The steps stopped just behind me. I could feel a presence there, close enough that the air seemed to shift with its movement. I kept recording. The final entry captured my breathing as it grew faster, then ragged. It captured the scrape of something metal against the floor, the sound of the crowbar being picked up, not by me. And then it captured the scream. When the shift officially ended at 6:00 a.m., the station transmitted all audio files to the central hub automatically as designed. They found the station intact. No signs of forced entry. No damage to the equipment. I was not there. My truck was still parked outside. My access key was still logged in the system. The final audio file was clear, timestamped correctly, and marked as complete. According to the records, Victor Lane worked the entire shift. And according to the recordings, he did exactly what was required of him. My name is Oliver Stone. I'm 34 years old, a civil engineer by training. And until recently I believed I was someone who understood how systems worked. Structures, procedures, cause and effect. I believed that if something existed, there was a record of it somewhere, and if it didn't, it couldn't reach out and touch you. I'm writing this now because that belief collapsed over the course of a single day, in a place that was supposed to be quiet, anonymous, and forgettable. I arrived just after dawn, the sky still the dull gray of a morning that hadn't fully decided to exist. The guest house sat at the edge of a rural county road, surrounded by low trees and fields that had long since stopped pretending to be farmland. It wasn't advertised online. A colleague had passed along a phone number, told me it was off the grid, and perfect if I needed a place to think. I had taken a week off after a structural failure investigation went badly. No casualties, but enough questions and pressure that I needed distance. One night, that was all I planned to stay. The building itself looked older than it probably was. 2 stories, faded white siding, a porch that sagged slightly in the middle, and a single wooden sign near the door that read U.S. House in lettering so worn it was almost decorative. No logo, no hours, no welcome mat. Just a bell hanging beside the door, the kind you'd ring in a place that didn't expect foot traffic. Inside, the air smelled faintly of dust and lemon cleaner. There was a front desk, though it felt generous to call it that. Just a long table, a brass bell, and a thick ledger laid open to the most recent page. The room was empty. No music, no voices, no movement beyond the quiet hum of something electrical deeper in the building. I stood there for a moment, adjusting my bag on my shoulder, rehearsing what I'd say when someone came out. Then I looked down at the ledger. At the top of the right-hand page, written in neat, dark ink, was a single line. Welcome, Oliver Stone. I didn't touch the book at first. I leaned closer, checking for some trick of the light or a pre-printed template I'd misunderstood. It wasn't printed. It wasn't stamped. It was handwritten. The letters consistent, but not mechanical, the ink slightly darker, where the pen had pressed harder on the curves of the O and S. Below the line, the rest of the page was blank. No other names, no dates. Just that greeting waiting. My first thought was that someone had made an educated guess. I'd called ahead the night before. I'd given my name. Maybe this was some attempt at personalization. a quirky touch meant to make the place feel welcoming. It still unsettled me, but not enough to trigger alarm. I've learned that discomfort often comes from unfamiliar systems, not broken ones. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding louder than it should have in the quiet. No answer. I rang the bell. The sound echoed down a hallway to my left, thin and metallic, then faded. I waited, counted my breaths, listened for footsteps. Nothing. Against my better judgment, I reached out and touched the ledger. The paper was thick, slightly rough, the way old books feel when they've been handled carefully. I flipped back a page, then another. Every page was the same. Blank, except for a single line at the top, each written in the same careful hand. "Welcome, Oliver Stone." Page after page, stretching back months, maybe years, all of them addressed to me. No variation, no mistakes, no other names. I closed the book. At that moment, I became acutely aware of how quiet the building was. Not the peaceful quiet of a place at rest, but the kind of silence that feels like it's listening back. I reminded myself that I was tired, stressed, primed to see patterns where none existed. I picked up the bell again, rang it harder this time. "Is anyone here?" A door opened somewhere down the hall. Soft footsteps approached. Relief washed over me so quickly, it almost felt embarrassing. The man who emerged looked exactly like you'd expect someone in a place like that to look. Late 50s, maybe early 60s. Thin. Gray hair pulled back neatly. He wore a cardigan despite the mild weather, and his expression was polite in the way that suggested long practice. "Mr. Stone," he said, smiling. "You made good time." I stared at him, the ledger forgotten for the moment. "Yes. Sorry. I didn't see anyone at the desk." "No trouble at all," he replied. "You're right on schedule." I didn't remember giving him one. He gestured toward the ledger. "If you'd like to sign in." I hesitated, then picked up the pen resting beside the book. The ink was the same dark blue, black as the greeting. My hand hovered over the page. "You've already written my name," I said, trying to keep my tone light. He smiled again, a little wider this time. "We'll like to be prepared." I signed beneath the greeting. The moment I finished, the ink dried instantly, as if it had been there all along. The man nodded, satisfied. "Room 7, he said, sliding a key across the table. "Second floor. You are only guest today." I wanted to ask him about the book, about the pages, about how long he'd been expecting me. Instead, I took the key and thanked him. Some instinct told me that pressing too hard, too early, would only make things stranger. The room was exactly what I needed, which only added to my unease. Clean, simple, a narrow bed, a desk by the window, a small bathroom with functioning hot water, no television, no artwork on the walls. The window looked out over the trees, their leaves barely moving in the still air. I set my bag down and sat on the edge of the bed, listening. Somewhere in the building, something clicked softly like a relay switching on and off. I checked my phone. No signal. I hadn't expected one. But seeing the empty bars made the isolation feel more deliberate. I spent the late morning trying to work, reviewing notes I'd brought with me, but my attention kept drifting back to the ledger, to the handwriting, to the certainty with which my name had been written, over and over, long before I'd arrived. At noon, there was a knock at the door. "Lunch," the man said, set out in the dining room. He didn't wait for a response. By the time I opened the door, the hallway was empty. The dining room held a single table, set for one. A plate of food I hadn't ordered, but would have chosen if given the chance. Simple. Warm. Familiar. I ate, telling myself that coincidence and good service could explain a lot. It was when I returned to my room and found the desk drawer open that my rational explanations began to thin. Inside the drawer was a folded sheet of paper. My name was written on the outside, in the same careful hand. This time, there was no greeting. Just a single sentence. "You're going to want to pay attention tonight." I stood there for a long time, the paper trembling slightly between my fingers, trying to decide when, exactly, I had crossed from being a guest into something else entirely. Part 2. I read the note 3 times, before folding it back along the original crease and placing it on the desk. The paper felt warmer than it should have been, as if it had just come from someone's pocket. I told myself that was imagination layered on top of adrenaline. Stress does strange things to perception. I knew that. I'd lectured junior engineers about it during post-incident reviews. How the brain fills gaps with narrative when certainty is missing. Still, I checked the door. The lock was intact. No scratches around the handle. No sign that anyone had been inside my room while I was gone. Except for the open drawer and the note that couldn't be explained away by housekeeping schedules or polite service. I considered leaving. That thought came quickly and cleanly, which surprised me. I hadn't even finished my coffee. My car was parked out front. Nothing physically prevented me from packing my bag and driving away. The road I'd come in on wasn't gated. There were no storms forecast. No emergencies tying me there. And yet, I stayed. I think part of me wanted to understand the mechanism behind what was happening. I'd spent my career dismantling failures, tracing outcomes back to overlooked assumptions. Walking away without answers felt like admitting defeat to something that, on the surface, still obeyed the rules of reality. There were no ghosts, no impossible sights, just information appearing where it shouldn't. That afternoon passed slowly. I tried reading, then pacing, then sitting by the window watching the trees. Every so often, I heard the soft clicking again, always from somewhere behind the walls, never loud enough to localize. When I stepped into the hallway to investigate, it stopped. At 4 in the afternoon, I went back downstairs. The front desk was empty, but the ledger was still there, open to the page I'd signed. I flipped forward this time instead of back. The next page had already been written. "Thank you for staying, Oliver Stone." Beneath it, in smaller handwriting, was the date. Today's date. I felt a tightening in my chest that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with recognition. This wasn't anticipation. It was confirmation. As if the building wasn't predicting my actions so much as recording them in advance. "Excuse me," I said aloud, my voice echoing uselessly. "I have a question." The man appeared from the hallway again, as if summoned by sound rather than time. "Of course," he said. "How can I help?" I held up the ledger. "This. Why does it keep? Why is my name already written?" He regarded the book calmly. "Quests like consistency." "That doesn't answer my question." "It does," he said gently. "Just not in the way you want." I tried a different angle. "How long have you worked here?" He smiled. "Long enough." "How long has this place been open?" "Long enough," he repeated without irony. I looked down at the ledger again. "Has anyone else stayed here recently?" His pause was brief, but noticeable. "Not recently." "Before me?" "Yes." I waited for him to elaborate. he didn't. What happened to them? I asked. They finished their stay. There was nothing threatening in his tone. No hint of menace. That somehow made the conversation worse. I closed the ledger. I think there's been a mistake, I said. I didn't realize this was interactive. His eyes flicked to my face, then back to the book. There hasn't been a mistake, Mr. Stone. But if you'd like to check out early, you're welcome to do so in the morning. In the morning. Yes. Checkout is at 9. I can't leave now. You can, he said. You just won't be finished. That was the moment I felt fear properly take hold. Not as panic, but as a cold, deliberate assessment. I nodded, thanked him, and returned to my room without another word. I spent the early evening sitting on the bed with my bag packed. I don't know why I didn't just pick it up and go. I told myself I was waiting for daylight, that driving unfamiliar roads at dusk wasn't wise. The truth was harder to articulate. The longer I stayed, the more it felt like the decision had already been made somewhere else, written down before I'd even thought to question it. At 6:30, there was another knock. Dinner placed silently outside my door. I didn't eat it. I listened instead, counting the minutes, watching the light shift as the sun dipped below the trees. When full darkness arrived, it did so abruptly, as if someone had flipped a switch. That was when the clicking grew louder. It wasn't coming from the walls anymore. It was coming from the hallway. I opened my door a fraction of an inch and looked out. At the far end of the corridor, near the stairwell, a small table had been set up that hadn't been there before. On it sat the ledger, closed now, and a single lamp casting a tight circle of light. The rest of the hallway was swallowed by shadow. I stepped out, barefoot, on the thin carpet, every sense tuned toward escape routes and worst-case scenarios. With each step closer to the table, the clicking resolved into something familiar. A pen. Someone was writing, but there was no one there. The pen moved on its own, scratching steadily across the page, stopping occasionally as if to consider its next word. I stood there, frozen, watching ink appear from nothing. When it finished, the pen was placed neatly beside the book. The clicking stopped. I approached the table slowly, every instinct screaming at me to turn around. The ledger was open to a new page. It was a transcript, not a prediction, not a greeting. A record. It described my day in exact, unsettling detail. My arrival time, the hesitation before signing, the contents of my lunch, the note in the drawer, even my thought, briefly entertained and dismissed, of leaving before dinner. The final line had been written moments ago. At 1942, Oliver Stone realizes he has been reading this entry for longer than is comfortable. I snapped the book shut. The lamp flickered, then steadied. The hallway behind me was still empty. Why are you doing this? I asked the silence. The answer came from behind me. So you don't forget. I turned. The man stood at the other end of the corridor, hands folded, expression unreadable. Forget what? I demanded. He walked toward me at an unhurried pace. That you were here. That you mattered. That you stayed. I didn't agree to this, I said. No, he replied. You agreed to rest. I laughed then, a short, brittle sound. This isn't rest. It is for us. For who? For the house, he said. For the record. I backed away until my shoulders brushed the wall. What happens at checkout? His smile returned, smaller this time. Why close the book? And me. You stop being current. The words landed with awful clarity. I thought of the blank pages before my arrival, of the repetition of my name stretching back through time, of guests who had finished their stay. "I want to see the earlier entries," I said. He shook his head. "Those are archived." "Where?" He glanced toward the stairwell. "Below." I looked at the darkened steps, then back at him. "If I go down there, will I be able to leave?" "Yes," he said, without hesitation. I didn't believe him, but I followed anyway, because by then it felt like the only way to keep my name from being written without me. The stairwell smelled different from the rest of the building. Older, damp, like paper that had absorbed too much air over too many years. The man went first, one hand resting lightly on the rail, his steps unhurried, as if he had all the time in the world and nowhere else to be. I followed, counting each step without meaning to, a habit I'd picked up during inspections when visibility was poor. 12 steps. 13. 14. The light from above thinned quickly, replaced by a low amber glow coming from below. At the bottom, the stairs opened into a long room that felt wider than the building should have allowed. The ceiling was low, the beams exposed and darkened with age. Along both walls stood shelves. On those shelves were ledgers, hundreds of them. They were arranged neatly, spines outward, each labeled with a name and a date range in the same careful handwriting I'd seen upstairs. Some names repeated. Most did not. The shelves stretched farther back than I could see, disappearing into shadow. "This is impossible," I said, though the word had lost much of its meaning by then. "It's meticulous," the man corrected. "There's a difference." I stepped closer to the nearest shelf. The first name I read wasn't mine. Neither was the second, or the third. Each book represented someone who had come here, stayed, and been recorded. Some date ranges spanned days, others only hours. A few were disturbingly brief, measured in minutes. "Why?" I asked. "Why keep all of this?" "To remember," he said again, as if repetition strengthened the truth of it. "People pass through places like this every day. Roads, rooms, buildings, they leave no mark. We exist to make sure some of them do. By trapping them, by witnessing them." I pulled a ledger from the shelf at random. The paper inside was filled edge to edge with writing, dense and precise. It read like a diary written by an impartial observer, recording not just actions, but thoughts, doubts, fleeting impulses the writer shouldn't have been able to know. The last entry ended abruptly, mid-sentence. "What happens to them?" I asked quietly. "They leave," he said. "That's not an answer." He met my gaze. "It's the only one that matters." I replaced the book and stepped back. My pulse was loud in my ears now, my earlier calm eroded by the sheer scale of the place. "You said I could leave if I came down here." "Yes." "When?" "After we finished tonight's entry." I laughed again, though there was no humor in it. "And if I refuse?" "You can't," he said, not unkindly. "You're already in it." He gestured toward the far end of the room, where a desk sat beneath a brighter light. On it lay a ledger I recognized immediately. Mine. The cover was newer than most, the spine uncreased. Beside it was the pen. I didn't move. "You don't have to write," he said. "That's not your role." "Then what is?" "To be accurate." I felt a strange pressure then. Not physical, but insistent, like the expectation you feel when a roomful of people goes quiet at once. I became acutely aware of myself. My posture, my breathing, the weight of my thoughts. It felt as though any deviation, any attempt to act unpredictably, would be noticed and corrected. I walked to the desk. The ledger was open to the current page. The day's entry continued from where it had left off upstairs, describing my descent into the basement with clinical neutrality. The final line was unfinished, the pen resting just beyond it. At 2211, Oliver Stone understands that. I waited, half expecting the pen to move on its own. It didn't. The man watched me closely. This is the part where most people try to bargain. I don't have anything you want, I said. You have time, he replied. At least you think you do. I looked at the shelves again, at the names and dates and endings. If I leave, will this stop? For you? He considered. For everyone else? I closed my eyes. For a moment, I imagined my name on one of those spines, years from now. Someone else pulling it down and reading about a man who thought systems could explain everything. I imagined the entry ending wherever they decided it should. I'm not staying, I said. He nodded as if he'd expected that answer. Then we'll conclude. The pen began to move. I watched, helpless, as the final lines were written. Understands that this place does not keep people. It keeps moments. The pen paused, then added one more sentence. He leaves before midnight. The light flickered. Somewhere above us, I heard the distant sound of a door unlocking. It's done, the man said. You can go. I didn't wait for further instruction. I turned and ran up the stairs, taking them two at a time, my breath ragged, my legs burning. The hallway above was dark but empty. My room door stood open. My bag was exactly where I'd left it. I grabbed it and headed for the front door. The ledger at the desk was gone. So was the man. The bell by the door rang as I pushed it open, the sound sharp and final. Outside, the night air was cold and real and wonderfully empty. I crossed the porch, half expecting the building to resist, to pull me back somehow. It didn't. My car started on the first try. The road stretched out ahead of me, unlit but familiar enough to follow. I drove without looking back, my hands shaking on the wheel. My mind replaying the day in fragments I didn't yet know how to arrange. I reached the main highway just before midnight. I pulled over then, unable to keep going, and sat there until my breathing slowed. My phone buzzed as signal returned, notifications flooding in all at once. Missed messages, emails, the ordinary noise of a life that hadn't noticed my absence. When I finally looked at the time, it was 12:03 a.m. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. Weeks passed before I could convince myself it was over. I returned to work. I resumed routines. I told no one what had happened, because there was no version of the story that didn't end with concerned looks and gentle suggestions. Then, one afternoon, a package arrived at my apartment. No return address. Inside was a single book, a ledger. My name was written on the spine, followed by a date range that ended at 23:59 on the night I left. I opened it with shaking hands. The pages were blank, all except the last one. Welcome back, Oliver Stone. Below it, in smaller handwriting, a note. You don't have to stay. We just like knowing where to find you. I closed the book and locked it away. But some nights, when the apartment is very quiet, I swear I can hear the soft clicking of a pen, waiting for me to do something worth recording. My name is Benjamin Cross. I am writing this while the sun is still technically up, because once night settles fully, outside the windows of the research dormitory, I know I will not be able to focus long enough to explain what happened. I am a climatology technician, contracted to maintain remote temperature monitoring stations in northern Alaska, and yesterday morning I arrived alone at station H9 to complete a routine 24-hour calibration cycle. This was not my first isolated assignment. I had already spent weeks at sites far colder, farther north, with nothing but radio check, ins and humming generators for company. Nothing about this job should have unsettled me. It was supposed to be simple, strictly procedural, and finished by the following dawn. Station H9 sits in a shallow valley, surrounded by spruce and permafrost flats. The building itself is a reinforced modular structure, steel frame, insulated panels, triple-pane windows, all designed to withstand extreme cold and wind. I arrived at 0940 local time, logged my arrival with headquarters, and began my inspection. Inside, everything looked exactly as expected. The heating system maintained a stable interior temperature, the backup generator tested within parameters, and the exterior sensors transmitted clean data. The place felt quiet but not empty, the kind of stillness you learn to appreciate when you work alone long enough. At 11:15, I noticed the first frost forming along the lower edge of the east-facing window. This was not unusual. Despite the insulation, extreme cold often creates thin crystalline patterns where the glass meets the frame. I made a mental note to check the seal later and continued working. It was only when I returned with my coffee mug and glanced up again that I realized the frost had spread far faster than it should have. The pattern was not random. It curved inward, branching in a way that immediately made my stomach tighten. Two shallow hollows formed near the center, like eye sockets. Below them, a narrow ridge suggested a nose pressed flat against the glass. The frost looked less like ice and more like a breath mark, frozen in the act of exhaling. I told myself it was pareidolia, the human tendency to find faces where none exist. I stepped closer, studying it analytically. Frost patterns follow temperature gradients. They branch, they feather, they overlap. Faces are an easy illusion. I wiped the glass with my glove. The pattern smeared and vanished instantly, leaving only clear glass and my own reflection staring back, slightly flushed, slightly embarrassed. By noon, the sky had clouded over. The light outside turned dull and colorless, the kind of flat gray that makes it difficult to judge distance. I finished my scheduled maintenance and documented sensor readings. At 1300, I performed a radio check-in. Headquarters confirmed receipt of my data and reminded me to remain on site until morning to monitor for any anomalies. I acknowledged and signed off. It was around 1430 when I noticed the second window. This time it was the north-facing one, the largest pane in the common room. Frost had begun forming along all four edges simultaneously, crawling inward with unnatural symmetry. I froze where I stood, watching as the pattern developed faster than any thermal model could justify. Within seconds, the shape was unmistakable. A face again, larger this time, the outline of a forehead, the indentation of cheeks, a mouth slightly open, as if in mid-speech. My heart began to pound, hard enough that I could hear it in my ears. I moved slowly, deliberately, reminding myself that panic had no place in a controlled environment. I approached the window and placed my palm against the glass. It was cold, but not colder than it should have been. I wiped the frost away. Behind the glass was nothing. No movement. No shadow. Only trees and drifting snow. I checked the exterior temperature logs. They showed no sudden drops, no fluctuations severe enough to explain the rapid frost formation. The interior humidity was normal. Everything according to the instruments was fine. By 1600, all 3 windows on the main floor had developed frost patterns. Each one formed the same shape, identical in scale, proportion, and orientation. The same face, pressed flat from the outside, as if someone had walked from window to window and leaned in close, exhaling slowly onto the glass. I did not wipe them away this time. I photographed them, time-stamped the images, and sent them to headquarters with a technical note describing unexplained rapid frost formation. I kept my language neutral, professional. I did not mention faces. I called them symmetrical frost anomalies. The reply came back 15 minutes later. They suggested a localized pressure and humidity interaction caused by wind patterns in the valley. They advised continued observation. At 17:30, as daylight began to fade, I heard the first sound from outside. It was not a knock. It was not footsteps. It was a soft, drawn-out noise, like fabric being dragged across ice. It came from the north side of the building, directly behind the window with the frost face still intact. I stood perfectly still, listening. The sound stopped as abruptly as it had begun. I forced myself to move. I grabbed my jacket, radio, and headlamp and unlocked the exterior door. The cold hit me immediately, sharp and biting. My breath fogged in front of me as I swept the beam of my headlamp across the snow. There were no footprints, no drag marks, no signs of disturbance at all. I circled the building slowly, methodically, shining my light at the windows from the outside. The frost patterns were visible even from here, pale shapes pressed against the glass from within. From this angle, they did not look like faces anymore. They looked like smears, like residue left behind by something that had been there moments before. I returned inside, locked the door, and checked the time. 1812. The sun had fully set by 1900. The interior lights cast long reflections across the windows, overlaying my own silhouette on top of the frost faces. I avoided looking at them directly. I busied myself with routine checks I had already completed, anything to keep my mind anchored in procedure. At 20:30, I noticed condensation forming on the inside of the glass, directly over the frost patterns. Warm, human breath, blooming and fading in slow pulses. I stepped back, my throat dry. The condensation appeared and disappeared rhythmically, as if something outside was breathing in time with me. I counted my breaths. I held my breath. The condensation continued. At 2100, every window on the main floor displayed the same face, perfectly aligned, perfectly still, pressed from the outside, waiting. I am trained to observe, to document, to remain rational. But standing there, alone in that building, surrounded by windows that all showed the same frozen human expression, I felt something shift inside me. Not fear exactly. Recognition. As if the station itself had become a boundary, and something beyond it had finally realized I was here. I am writing this at 21:47. The frost has thickened. The faces are clearer now, the features more defined. I can see the shape of lips, the suggestion of closed eyes. And just a few minutes ago, one of them smiled. I did not approach the window after that. I stayed where I was, seated at the narrow desk beneath the ceiling light, my laptop open and recording ambient audio, without my conscious decision to start it. The smile had been subtle, just a shallow upward curve along the frost where a mouth should not have been. But once I saw it, I could not convince myself it had been an illusion. The shape remained fixed, unchanged, as if the ice itself had decided to remember something human. At 22:05, the heating system cycled. Warm air flowed through the vents, and I watched the frost patterns react. They did not melt evenly. The edges thinned, but the facial features remained intact, reinforced by new ice forming around them. It was like the system was feeding them definition instead of erasing it. I checked the thermostat twice, then a third time, confirming the set point had not changed. I attempted another radio call at 22:17. Static answered first, then a brief burst of distorted feedback that almost sounded like overlapping voices. I repeated my call sign, enunciating carefully, keeping my voice steady. The response came back delayed, clipped as if filtered through something thick. They asked if I was experiencing weather interference. I said yes. I did not elaborate. After the transmission ended, the ambient noise inside the station shifted. The generator's steady hum developed a faint oscillation, a rise and fall that created a rhythm uncomfortably close to breathing. I pressed my ear against the wall near the north window. The sound was louder there, resonating through the structure as if something outside was using the building itself as a diaphragm. At 22:40, frost began forming on the interior surfaces of the glass. This was not condensation freezing. The temperature inside had not dropped. The frost appeared suddenly, crawling outward from the exact points where the faces pressed from the other side. 2 layers, perfectly aligned, separated by inches of reinforced glass, inside and outside mirroring each other, face to face. I backed away until my shoulders touched the opposite wall. My reflection overlapped the frost, my own features breaking apart as they passed through the ice patterns. I closed my eyes, counted slowly, and forced myself to think like a technician again. If this was a physical phenomenon, it had rules. Rules could be understood. I took out my infrared thermometer and aimed it at the glass. The readings spiked and dipped erratically, as if the surface could not decide what temperature it wanted to be. One section, right where the mouth was forming on the inside layer, read significantly warmer than the rest. Something tapped the glass. Once, soft, deliberate, it came from the north window again. I felt it through the soles of my boots, a vibration more than a sound. I did not move. I did not respond. I stood perfectly still, staring at the overlapping frost faces, waiting for the next tap. It did not come. Instead, the tapping moved. A faint knock echoed from the east window, then the south, then the west, circling the building slowly, methodically. Each tap spaced evenly apart, as if whoever, or whatever, was outside was walking, stopping briefly at each window to announce its presence. By the time the tapping returned to the north side, my hands were shaking badly enough that I had to set the thermometer down to keep from dropping it. The frost faces had changed again. Their expressions were no longer neutral. The brows seemed lower, the mouths thinner, stretched into something that looked uncomfortably close to concentration. I realized then that they were all facing inward, not outward, toward the cold, toward me. At 23:15, the power flickered. The lights dimmed for half a second before stabilizing. The generator did not falter. The systems showed no fault. But in that brief dip of light, the frost patterns shifted. I saw it clearly this time. The faces leaned closer, pressing harder, flattening against the glass as if testing it. I shouted then. I did not plan to. The sound tore out of my throat, sharp and uncontrolled, filling the room and bouncing back at me. The tapping stopped immediately. The building fell into an unnatural silence, so complete that even the generator seemed muted. I waited for something to answer. Nothing did. Midnight passed without ceremony. My watch vibrated softly at 100, the only acknowledgement that the day had technically ended. I marked the time in my log, my handwriting uneven, the ink pressing hard into the paper. According to my contract, I still had several hours to endure before relief arrived. At 23, I noticed movement in the frost. It was subtle, a slow deformation along the cheek of the face on the north window. The ice stretched, thinned, then reformed. The mouth opened wider, the shape elongating downward as if trying to speak through the glass. No sound came, but the ambient noise inside the station shifted again, the oscillation growing stronger, more pronounced. I began to feel pressure in my ears, like a rapid change in altitude. My head throbbed. The air felt thick, difficult to draw into my lungs. I checked the oxygen monitor. Normal. I moved toward the interior hallway, away from the windows, hoping distance would dull the effect. The pressure followed me. It intensified near the storage room, the smallest, most enclosed space in the building. Frost had begun forming along the metal doorframe, creeping inward despite the warmth inside. I understood then that the windows were not the source. They were just where it was easiest to see. At 01:05, the tapping returned, this time from inside the walls. It traveled along the structure, tracing the seams between panels, moving upward, then down, like fingers exploring the building's interior. I pressed my back against the hallway wall, feeling the vibration through my spine. The frost faces changed again. Their mouths closed. Their eyes, which had always been indistinct, sharpened. I could see the suggestion of lids now, lashes etched in ice. All of them blinked at once. I covered my face with my hands, squeezing my eyes shut, forcing myself not to look. When I opened them again, the faces were closer than before. The frost had advanced inward across the glass, narrowing the clear space until my reflection was framed by ice on all sides. They were not smiling anymore. They were watching. At 0200, I attempted one last radio call. My voice sounded wrong to my own ears, strained, distant. The response came immediately, far too quickly, before any signal delay could be accounted for. It repeated my words back to me, perfectly, but layered beneath them was a second voice, slightly out of sync, like an echo anticipating what I was about to say. I shut the radio off and threw it onto the desk. The frost on the interior glass began to melt, not evenly, but in streaks that ran downward like tears. Behind the melting ice, the faces remained, pressed so close now that I could see texture, pores suggested by uneven crystal growth. At 02:37, the first crack appeared in the north window. It was small, no more than a hairline fracture near the edge, but the sound it made when it formed was unmistakable. A sharp, brittle snap, followed by a low, satisfied hum that resonated through the building. The faces did not move. They did not need to. They had learned where the boundary was weakest, and they were patient. The crack did not spread right away. It stayed thin and motionless, a fragile white vein in the reinforced glass, as if the window itself were holding its breath. I stood several steps back, my body angled instinctively toward the hallway, every muscle prepared to run despite knowing there was nowhere to go. The frost faces remained pressed close, their features undisturbed by the fracture inches from them. They looked calm, certain. I checked my watch again. 02:41. The night had stopped feeling like time passing and started feeling like something enclosing me, tightening incrementally with each minute. I knew the relief team, was scheduled to arrive shortly after sunrise. But that knowledge offered no comfort. Whatever this was, it had not waited for daylight before. There was no reason to believe it would start now. I retrieved the emergency maintenance kit at room, forcing myself to move slowly, deliberately, as if sudden motion might provoke the thing outside or inside. My hands brushed the metal shelves, cold enough now that my skin stuck, for a fraction of a second before releasing. Frost coated the interior corners of the room, delicate and invasive, creeping further inward with every breath I took. When I returned to the main room, the crack had lengthened. It branched downward, splitting into two fives that curved toward the center of the pane. The sound of stress traveled through the glass in faint, intermittent ticks, like the second hand of a clock counting down. I did not need instruments to tell me. The temperature difference across the window was no longer within safe limits. The structure was being pushed past what it was designed to endure. The frost face closest to the fracture changed expression. Its mouth softened, the rigid line of ice rounding slightly at the edges. The suggestion of lips pressed forward, not smiling, not frowning, but shaping something deliberate. The interior frost mirrored it perfectly. Two mouths separated by inches of glass, moving in silent synchronization. I felt a sudden, overwhelming certainty that if the glass broke, it would not shatter outward. It would open inward. At Vol.50, the generator faltered for the first time since I arrived. The lights dimmed, brightened, then dimmed again. The oscillating hum deepened, dropping into a frequency I felt more than heard. My chest vibrated with it, my breath stuttering as my body tried to adjust to the pressure changes. The frost on the interior glass melted rapidly then, peeling back from the center outward as if retreating. For one brief moment, the window cleared enough for me to see my reflection properly again. My face looked unfamiliar, pale, drawn, older than it should have been. Behind my reflection, the frost face on the exterior glass remained. Its eyes were open now. They were not eyes in any biological sense. There was no color, no pupil, no sclera. Just two darker voids where the frost thinned, revealing the night beyond. But they were focused, intent. I stepped back again, my heel catching on the edge of the rug. I stumbled and caught myself against the desk, knocking my laptop to the floor. It landed face up, screen still lit, the audio recording still running. The waveforms spiked sharply as the generator coughed, and the building shuddered. The crack spread. This time it was audible, a slow, creeping tear accompanied by a low grinding sound as the glass adjusted under pressure. The frost faces leaned closer in unison, their features distorting as the surface beneath them weakened. I could see individual ice crystals shifting, reorienting themselves to maintain the shape as the window failed. I screamed again, not out of fear this time, but anger. A raw, desperate sound meant to assert my presence, my humanity, against whatever was trying to erase it. My voice echoed harshly off the walls and died quickly, swallowed by the oppressive quiet that followed. The response came not as sound, but sensation. The pressure in my ears spiked sharply, pain blooming behind my eyes. For a split second, I was convinced my head would split open from the inside. Then, just as suddenly, it eased. The oscillation faded. The building's hum returned to something close to normal. The frost faces stopped moving. The crack stopped spreading. For a long moment, nothing happened at all. I stood there shaking, my lungs burning as I realized I had been holding my breath again. I exhaled slowly, carefully, as if afraid the sound might break the fragile truce. My watch read 03:17. The silence felt different now, less anticipatory, more satisfied. I approached the window despite myself, drawn forward by a need to understand, to confirm that what I was seeing was real and not the final unraveling of my nerves. The frost face was still there, but its features were less defined, already softening at the edges. The interior frost had fully melted, leaving only clear glass between me and the night. I placed my hand against the window, my palm hovering inches from the crack. The glass was warmer now, unnaturally so. That was when I noticed the mark. Just below the fracture, pressed faintly into the frost, was the outline of a hand. 5 elongated shapes, splayed wide, the suggestion of joints visible where the ice thickened. It was far too large to be human, spanning nearly half the width of the pane. As I stared, the frost began to recede rapidly, collapsing inward, the face dissolving into abstract patterns and then nothing at all. Within seconds, the window was clear, save for the crack and the faint smear where the handprint had been. Outside, the valley lay still and empty. At 04702, the power stabilized completely. The generator returned to its steady hum. The pressure in my ears faded, leaving only a dull H behind. Frost retreated from the interior surfaces as if it had never been there. The building felt normal again. Too normal. I did not sleep. I sat with my back against the wall until dawn, watching the windows as the sky slowly lightened from black to deep blue to a washed out gray. When the first hint of sunlight touched the snow outside, I felt something release its grip on the station. The air felt lighter, easier to breathe. At 06:38, the relief team arrived. They found me exactly where I was supposed to be, equipment logged, systems operational. No visible damage beyond a single cracked window. I told them there had been a rapid temperature fluctuation overnight, likely a structural stress issue. They accepted the explanation without question. The data supported it. The logs showed nothing unusual. No abnormal readings. No unexplained drops or spikes. Later, back at headquarters, I reviewed the audio recording from my laptop. Most of it was exactly what I expected. Generator noise, footsteps, my own breathing, but between 02600 and the 0300, layered beneath the ambient hum, was something else. A sound so low it barely registered, rising and falling in a rhythm, unmistakably close to speech. When I slowed it down and isolated the frequency, I heard my own voice, not repeating what I had said, anticipating it. The cracked window at station H9 was replaced later that day. The technicians reported no abnormalities during the repair. No unusual frost. No structural anomalies beyond standard stress wear. But sometimes, when I close my eyes at night, I can still see it. The frost forming. The face pressing closer. Waiting for the glass to thin again. Waiting for me to be alone. My name is Scott Avery. I am writing this less than 24 hours after the shift ended, while the details are still sharp enough to hurt. I've been advised, quietly, off the record, not to put any of this in an official incident report. That advice came from someone who wouldn't meet my eyes while giving it. I understand now why. What happened yesterday doesn't fit cleanly into paperwork, and it certainly doesn't fit into the way I understood my job, my routine, or myself. I have worked as a night security officer at the Pine Ridge Logistics Facility for a little over 6 years. It's not a glamorous post. The building sits alone on the edge of an industrial park that never fully developed, surrounded by paved roads, scrub trees, and chain link fences that hum softly when the wind moves through them. My job is simple: clock in, change into uniform, log equipment, patrol the interior and exterior on a fixed schedule, and hand the site off at dawn. I work alone. I always have. That routine is important to me. Predictability is what keeps night shifts manageable. The same locker, the same badge, the same flashlight with the cracked lens. Never bothered to replace because it still worked. I know the smell of the locker room when I open the door at 6:48 p.m. Industrial cleaner layered over old sweat and metal. And I know exactly which fluorescent light flickers for half a second before stabilizing. Nothing about the start of yesterday's shift was supposed to be different. At 6:50 p.m., I opened my locker. My uniform was already hanging inside. For a moment, my brain refused to process what I was seeing. That sounds dramatic, but it's the only accurate way to describe it. I stood there with the locker door open, keys still in my hand, staring at a dark blue shirt and matching trousers on a hanger that did not belong to me. My first thought was simple confusion. Maybe I had come in early, and the day guard hadn't cleared out yet. That thought died quickly. Day shift doesn't use lockers. They don't change on site. Then I noticed the details. The uniform was my size. Not close, exact. The trousers hung at the same length mine do when they're freshly pressed. The shirt's name patch read AVRY, stitched in the same slightly crooked way mine is. Even the small fray at the left cuff, where I'd once snagged it on a fence, was there. I reached out and touched the fabric. It was damp. Not soaked, not dripping. Just damp enough that my fingers came away cool. The smell hit me a second later. Sweat, unmistakably fresh, layered with the faint metallic tang of rain and something else I couldn't immediately identify. The kind of smell that tells you fabric has been worn for hours, not stored. I checked the locker number twice, then a third time. Then I looked down at the uniform I was wearing. It was also mine. I stood there longer than I'm proud of, staring back and forth between the uniform on my body and the one hanging in the locker, trying to assemble a reasonable explanation. Facility's mistake. Some kind of cruel joke. A spare uniform ordered without my knowledge. None of those accounted for the dampness. None of them explained why the hanger was warm when I lifted it off the bar. I did what training tells you to do when something doesn't make sense. I documented it. I took out my phone and snapped 3 photos wide shot. Close up of the name patch. Close up of the damp fabric. Then I checked the locker for anything else out of place. My boots were where I'd left them that morning. My spare flashlight was still clipped inside the door. Nothing was missing. I locked the locker, hung my keys back on my belt, and went to clock in. The system accepted my badge without hesitation. The timestamp read 7:00 p.m. exactly. My patrol schedule printed automatically, just like it always did. No alerts, no notes, no indication that anyone else had accessed the building after the day guard left at 4:30. I told myself I'd deal with the locker later. The first patrol was uneventful, which should have been reassuring. The cameras showed empty corridors, motion sensors stayed quiet, and the exterior gates were sealed. The rain started around 7:40, light but steady, tapping against the metal siding in a way that usually helps me settle into the rhythm of the night. I followed my route, checked doors, logged temperatures in the server wing, and marked everything as normal. By the second patrol, small things began to feel off. My radio crackled once, sharply, like someone keying the mic and releasing it too fast. I checked the channel. Still on the correct frequency. No incoming calls. A few minutes later, I passed one of the reflective panels near the loading bays and caught my own reflection at an odd angle. For a split second, it looked like the patch on my chest was darker than usual, as if damp. When I looked down directly, it was dry. I reminded myself that fatigue plays tricks on perception. Night shifts train you to doubt your instincts before anything else. At 9:12 p.m., I returned to the locker room. I hadn't planned to. My route doesn't take me there again until the end of the shift. But the thought of that second uniform had been sitting at the back of my mind like a low grade pressure headache. And I needed to see it again to reassure myself it hadn't somehow changed. The locker room lights were on. I am meticulous about turning them off. The switch is right by the door. I know the feel of it under my thumb. Still, there they were, humming softly, every row illuminated. I walked to my locker and opened it. The uniform was no longer hanging neatly. It was folded. Carefully. Precisely. Shirt smoothed flat, trousers creased, hanger removed and placed on the bottom shelf. The fabric was still damp, but less so than before, as if it had been given time to air out. On top of the folded shirt sat my badge. Not the spare. Not an old one. The badge I was wearing. I looked down. My chest was bare. I don't remember taking the badge off. I don't remember feeling the weight leave my shirt. I stood there, breathing slowly, listening to the faint sound of rain on the roof, trying not to let panic override reason. There are only so many ways a badge can move from your chest to a locker. All of them involve your hands. I checked my pockets. My keys were still there. My radio. My flashlight. Everything accounted for, except the badge. Now sitting neatly on top of a uniform that should not exist. I picked it up. The metal was warm. Not room temperature. Not cold from the air-conditioned room. Warm in the way something is warm after being held. I locked the locker again. This time, I tested the lock twice. Then I wrote a note in my logbook. Not the official incident log, the personal one I keep for things that don't belong anywhere else. I described the uniform, the dampness, the badge. I noted the time and underlined it twice. The rest of the shift continued, outwardly normal and internally strained. Every reflection made me pause. Every sound felt a fraction too close. I kept expecting the radio to crackle again, but it stayed silent. Cameras showed empty hallways. Motion sensors remained inactive. At 11:58 p.m., my phone buzzed with a system notification. ACCES log UPDAT. That was unusual. Access logs update in batches at the end of shifts, not in real time. I opened the app. A new entry sat at the top of the list. Sotiavirwy, Leosika Ram, 11:41 p.m. I was standing in the security office at 11:41 p.m., reviewing camera feeds. I know this because the camera in the office shows me doing exactly that, time-stamped clearly in the corner of the screen. The log did not care. I stared at my name on the screen. At the time I could prove I was somewhere else, and felt the last of my certainty drain away. The building was telling me, calmly and without explanation, that I had been in two places at once. Outside, the rain picked up, heavier now, loud enough to drown out the subtle hum of the lights. Somewhere down the corridor, a door closed. I told myself it was the wind. I told myself a lot of things that night. None of them held. I didn't go looking for the sound of the door closing. That's important to say, because later, when I replayed the night in my head, It felt like a choice I must have made. In reality, my body reacted before my thoughts did. I was already out of the chair, already holding the flashlight, before I consciously decided to move. The corridor outside the security office was empty. The rain had grown louder, drumming against the roof hard enough to vibrate through the walls. And for a moment I wondered if the sound I'd heard had been nothing more than pressure shifting in the building. That would have been comforting. It would have meant everything still followed rules I understood. I checked the nearest camera feed on the tablet mounted by the door. No movement. No alerts. The door at the far end of the corridor, the one that led toward the locker rooms, was closed. It should have been. It always was. I stepped into the hall anyway. The air felt different there. Cooler, slightly damp. As if the humidity from outside had seeped through cracks that shouldn't exist. My boots echoed softly with each step, the sound stretching longer than it should have in a space that narrow. I told myself the acoustics were off because of the rain. Halfway down the corridor, my radio crackled again. This time, it didn't cut off immediately. There was breathing on the line. Slow. Controlled. Close enough that I could hear the faint hitch at the end of each inhale, the way someone sounds after physical exertion. I brought the radio up, thumb hovering over the transmit button, and waited for a voice to follow. None did. Control to any unit, I said finally, keeping my tone even. Identify. The breathing stopped. Static filled the channel for a second, then cleared completely. No reply. I checked the frequency again, even though I knew it hadn't changed. There was no reason anyone else should be on that channel. I was the only unit assigned to the site overnight. I resumed walking. The locker room door was unlocked. That detail landed heavily. It was part of my routine to check it during the final patrol and secure it for the night. I hadn't done that yet. I was sure of it. Still, the handle turned easily under my hand. Inside, the lights were off. I stood in the doorway for a moment, listening. The room smelled faintly of damp fabric and metal, stronger than before, as if someone had been there recently. I flicked the lights on. My locker was open. Not just unlocked. Open wide, the door pressed back against the adjacent unit. The second uniform was gone. In its place hung mine, the one I had been wearing. I looked down at myself, at the clothes on my body, and felt something cold settle in my stomach. The uniform on the hanger was identical down to every worn seam, every faded edge. The fabric was damp in the same way the other one had been earlier. Recently worn. My boots squeaked slightly as I stepped closer. I reached out and touched the sleeve. Warm. I pulled my hand back as if burned. This is the point where I should have called my supervisor. I know that. I also know why I didn't. Explaining that I'd found my own uniform hanging my locker while I was still wearing it would have sounded like a breakdown, not a report. I needed more information. Proof. Something concrete. I closed the locker, locked it, and pocketed the key. Then I checked the rest of the room. No signs of forced entry. No wet footprints on the floor. The drains by the sinks were dry. The windows were sealed. On impulse, I checked the clock above the lockers. 11:59 p.m. The minute hand clicked over to midnight as I watched. My radio came to life again. This time, there was a voice. Patrol complete, it said. My voice, not distorted, not muffled. Clear and familiar. Speaking with the same neutral cadence I used when logging routine checks. The words echoed faintly in the room, as if the speaker was standing just out of sight. I stood perfectly still. The radio crackled once more. Locker secure. No anomalies. I didn't respond. I couldn't. My mouth felt dry, my tongue heavy. Somewhere behind me, the lockers creaked softly, metal shifting against metal. I backed toward the door without turning around. The radio went silent again. I didn't run. I walked back to the security office at a pace that felt agonizingly slow, forcing myself not to look into reflective surfaces, not to check corners too quickly. When I reached the office, I locked the door behind me and sat down hard in the chair. The camera feed still showed empty corridors. The access log updated again at 12:03 a.m. Escota VRY, INTR IOR PRTRL 12:01 a.m. I stared at the entry until the letters blurred. The system wasn't glitching randomly. It was recording actions that followed my schedule exactly. My route, my timing, my language. Someone or something was doing my job. I rewound the camera footage at 12:01 a.m. The feed from Corridor B flickered slightly. For less than a second, the image warped, like heat distortion. Then it stabilized. The corridor remained empty. I rewound it again frame by frame this time. There, between frames, was a shape. It stood where I would have been during that patrol, positioned just far enough from the camera to avoid clear detail. The outline was wrong in subtle ways. Shoulders too still, posture too precise, like a mannequin posed to imitate a person. The reflective strips on the uniform caught the light, flaring brightly. There was no face. Where my head should have been, the image blurred into static. The shape moved on the next frame, vanishing as abruptly as it had appeared. I pushed the chair back and stood, heart hammering. The building felt different now, heavier, as if it were occupied by something that didn't belong but had settled in anyway. The rain outside intensified, thunder rolling low and distant. At 12:30 a.m., I heard footsteps. They followed my patrol rhythm exactly. Left.
Pause.
Left, right?
Pause. The sound moved down the corridor outside the office, past the door, and continued on. I didn't open the door. I watched the camera feed instead. The corridor remained empty. The footsteps stopped at the far end, where the locker room was. A moment later, the access log updated. Escot Avira Loklakura 20:34 a.m. I closed my eyes briefly, pressing my palms against them, and tried to ground myself. Fatigue, stress, auditory hallucinations were not unheard of during long night shifts. But hallucinations didn't leave access logs. They didn't move uniforms. They didn't breathe into radios. When I opened my eyes, the security office clock read 12:35 a.m. My radio clicked on without static. Almost done. My voice said softly. The tone was different this time. Closer, lower, as if the speaker was right outside the door. I stood, flashlight raised, and faced the door. The handle began to turn. Slowly. From the other side, fabric brushed softly against metal. The sound of a damp uniform shifting with movement. I could smell it through the crack beneath the door now. Sweat, rain, and that faint metallic note. Shift change, my voice said, right outside. You can rest now. The handle stopped turning. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. After a long moment, the footsteps resumed, moving away from the door, back into the building. The access log updated one last time. Esexter IOR PTROL. 12:41 a.m. Dawn was still hours away. I stayed in the security office until my hands stopped shaking enough to think clearly. Whatever was walking my routes wasn't improvising. It was following the schedule to the letter. That meant it would finish the shift. And when it did, there would be one more place it needed to go. My locker. I realized then that the second uniform wasn't a mistake. It was preparation. I counted the minutes by the second hand on the clock, because the idea of sleeping, of losing awareness even briefly, felt more dangerous than exhaustion. The security office was the only place in the building where I felt even marginally anchored to myself. One door, one desk, one chair. I sat with my back against the wall, flashlight across my knees, eyes flicking between the clock, the camera feeds, and the access log. The system kept updating. Every entry bore my name. Every action followed my established routine with unnerving precision. Exterior fence check. Generator inspection. South loading bay sweep. The timestamps lined up with the schedule I'd memorized over years of repetition. At 20:17 a.m., the radio crackled softly. No voice this time. Just the faint sound of rain and footsteps, picked up by the mic as if whoever carried it was moving through the storm. The rhythm was steady, unhurried, confident. I turned the volume down without thinking. By 300 a.m., the rain had eased into a thin mist. The cameras showed the exterior grounds slick and reflective under the floodlights, empty except for drifting vapor. Then, on camera 6, something moved. A figure crossed the edge of the frame near the perimeter fence. I froze the feed. The uniform was unmistakable. Dark blue fabric. Reflective strips. My build. My height walked with the same efficient economy of motion I'd developed to conserve energy on long shifts. The figure paused at the fence, leaned in slightly, and raised a hand to test the chain links. I zoomed in. The image blurred around the head again, refusing to resolve into anything recognizable. Where a face should have been, the pixels smeared and shimmered. Like a bad signal struggling to lock in, the figure turned slowly, deliberately, until it was facing the camera. I felt a sharp, irrational certainty that it could see me through the screen. The feed cut out. Not black, just frozen. The last frame burned into the monitor. I checked the other cameras. All functioning normally. Camera 6 alone remained locked, unresponsive to input. The access log updated at 3:06 a.m. Stita virwai, piramitiar sewer. I swallowed hard. My throat felt raw, as if I'd been breathing cold air for hours. The thing outside wasn't just copying my actions. It was communicating through the systems that recognized me as the only legitimate presence on site. At 4:30 a.m., the first hint of dawn crept into the sky, a faint lightening at the edges of the horizon. Relief should have followed. Instead, a new tension settled over me. Day shift would arrive at 700. That left 2.5 hours. 2.5 hours until the shift officially ended. At 5:12 a.m. the footsteps returned. They stopped directly outside the security office. This time the camera facing the corridor showed something. The figure stood just beyond the door, close enough that the edges of the uniform filled most of the frame. The reflective strips flared brightly under the hallway lights. The head tilted slightly, as if listening. The radio clicked on. "Almost there," my voice said, calm and reassuring. "You did fine tonight." I stood slowly, my legs stiff. The flashlight felt heavy in my hand. I didn't point it at the door. I didn't speak. The door handle didn't move. After a moment, the figure stepped back and turned away. I watched it walk down the corridor on the monitor. Footsteps perfectly synchronized with its movement. At the far end, it paused at the locker room door. The access log updated. Eskitia vry, OCKRAM, 5:18 a.m. What was going to happen? The certainty of it settled over me with a strange calm. The second uniform had never been meant for storage. It was meant to be worn at the end. I left the security office. The corridor was empty, but the air felt charged, buzzing faintly against my skin. The locker room lights were on again. I stood in the doorway for a long moment before stepping inside. My locker was open. Inside, the uniform hung neatly on the bar. Dry now. Clean. Pressed. The fabric looked newer than mine had in years. The name patch, AVRY, was perfectly straight. Beneath it, on the shelf, sat my boots. Not the ones I'd changed out of at the start of the shift. The ones I was wearing. I looked down. My feet were bare. The concrete floor was cold against my skin. I couldn't remember when the boots had left my feet. There was no gap in my memory large enough to account for it. It was as if that detail had simply been edited out. Behind me, the locker room door closed. I turned slowly. The figure stood a few feet away, close enough now that I could see the fine detail of the uniform, the stitching, the slight sheen of recently dried fabric. The head was still wrong, the space where a face should have been refusing to hold form, shifting subtly like static on an untuned screen. It raised a hand. The gesture mirrored one I'd made 1,000 times while clocking out. Shift change, my voice said from the radio clipped to its chest. Thank you for your service. I shook my head. No, I said. My voice sounded thin, distant. I'm still here. The figure tilted its head again. You were, it replied. Now you're off duty. It stepped aside, gesturing toward the locker. Understanding hit me with nauseating clarity. The system didn't care who I was. It cared who was wearing the uniform, who matched the badge, who fit the pattern. The building recognized continuity, not identity. I won't, I said. You can't make me. The figure didn't move closer. It didn't need to. The lights flickered once, briefly. The access log updated on the small screen above the lockers. SKFTAVRY. CFComP@E. Fountain 29 a.m. The clock on the wall clicked forward. 5:30 a.m. The figure stepped toward the door, then paused. You should hurry, it said. Day shift will be here soon. It opened the locker room door and left. I stood there shaking, staring at the uniform hanging in my locker, the boots on the shelf, the badge resting neatly on the folded shirt beneath them. I don't know how long I stood there. When I finally moved, it was because the lights dimmed slightly, the building transitioning into its morning power cycle. I made a choice. I didn't put the uniform on. I grabbed my phone, my keys, and my wallet from the bench where I'd left them earlier. I walked barefoot through the corridors, past empty checkpoints and silent cameras, and out the emergency exit at the back of the building. The cool morning air hit my skin like a shock. I didn't stop moving until I reached my car. At 6:58 a.m., as I sat in the driver's seat, the access log updated one final time on my phone. SCOVRY, DACFT, HANDOF, 700 a.m. I resigned that morning, no notice. No explanation I could put into words that would make sense. The uniform is still there. I know because I drove past the facility once, weeks later, and saw someone patrolling the perimeter. Same height, same build, same calm, efficient stride. They didn't look up as I passed. I don't wear uniforms anymore. And when I open my closet some mornings, I check carefully before stepping inside, just to make sure there isn't a second version of my clothes hanging there, clean, dry, and waiting for me to finish a shift I never agreed to give up. My name is Michael Rowan. I am 30. 6 years old, employed by the Regional Forestry Service as a maintenance and logistics officer. And until recently, I believed that every incident I encountered in the field could be explained through routine. Mechanical failure, human error, or environmental stress. I have never been prone to superstition, nor have I ever reported anything without first exhausting every reasonable explanation. What I am about to describe occurred over the course of a single day and night at a remote wilderness outpost assigned to me for a standard inspection and overnight occupancy. I am documenting it now because I have reviewed my notes, audio logs, and timestamps repeatedly, and there is no discrepancy. Everything happened exactly as I remember it. The outpost was located deep within a protected forest zone, accessible only by a service road that had not been driven in weeks. My assignment was simple: arrive before noon, inspect structural integrity, test communications equipment, remain overnight to monitor generator performance, and depart the following morning. I arrived shortly after 10:40 a.m. The weather was stable, cold but clear, with no wind strong enough to interfere with the tree line or radio signals. The building itself was a single-room structure reinforced with metal shutters, a steel door, and a mechanical deadbolt operated from the inside. There was no automated locking system. I verified this immediately upon arrival, as procedure requires. I unlocked the door with my issued key, entered, and secured it behind me. The interior was exactly as expected: cot, desk, radio console, emergency supplies, and a heavy steel door with a manual deadbolt mounted at waist height. I tested the bolt 3 times. It slid smoothly into the reinforced frame and retracted without resistance. There were no electronic components, no sensors, no remote triggers. Once satisfied, I logged my arrival time and began my inspection. For the first several hours, nothing unusual occurred. I checked the generator, recorded voltage levels, tested the radio on 3 assigned frequencies, and completed the standard checklist. I ate a late lunch, reviewed past maintenance logs, and noted that the outpost had been unoccupied for just under 3 weeks. There were no reports of wildlife interference or mechanical irregularities. At approximately 3:15 p.m., I decided to step outside to perform a perimeter check before dusk. When I reached for the door handle and pulled, it did not move. At first, I assumed I had forgotten to retract the deadbolt. I turned to slide it back and froze. The bolt was already fully retracted. I checked again, pushing it forward and pulling it back, watching the metal tongue slide cleanly in and out of the frame. The handle, however, remained rigid. I applied more pressure, then less. Nothing. The door did not budge. My immediate thought was thermal expansion. Cold metal can seize under certain conditions, especially if moisture is present. I stepped back, applied steady pressure with my shoulder, then stopped when the door made a dull, unmoving sound. There was no flex, no vibration. It was as if the door had been welded shut from the outside. I took out my radio to call in a routine issue report. Before I could press the transmit button, I heard something outside. It was not a knock. It was a sound I can only describe as contact. Something brushing against the exterior wall near the door, slow and deliberate, producing a faint dragging noise along the metal siding. I stood still, listening. The sound moved from left to right, then stopped directly on the other side of the door. I waited for it to continue. It did not. After roughly 10 seconds, the door handle turned from the outside. The motion was careful, almost testing, as if whoever, or whatever, was checking whether the door would open. The handle rotated fully downward, then returned to its original position. I did not move. I did not speak. I did not reach for the bolt. I simply watched the door, aware of how loud my breathing suddenly felt in the quiet room. Then the handle turned again. This time, the door unlocked itself. I felt it before I saw it. A subtle shift in pressure, followed by the unmistakable metallic click of the deadbolt sliding open on its own. The bolt moved smoothly, retracting fully, in the housing without any contact from my side of the door. The handle turned again, and the door began to open inward. I stepped back instinctively, heart racing, already rehearsing what I would say if this was some kind of unauthorized entry. The door opened less than an inch, then stopped. There was nothing there, no person, no animal, no movement. Just the empty forest beyond the threshold, perfectly still. I waited several seconds, then stepped forward and pulled the door open fully. The clearing outside was exactly as I had seen it earlier. No footprints in the dirt, no disturbed leaves, no marks on the doorframe. I stepped outside and immediately felt exposed, as if I had just done something incorrect. The air felt heavier. Not colder, not warmer. Just dense, like standing underwater without the pressure. I scanned the tree line, listening. Nothing. No birds. No wind. No distant animal sounds. The silence felt intentional. After less than a minute, I returned inside, closed the door, and slid the deadbolt into place myself. I stood there for a moment, hand resting on the metal, feeling foolish for being unsettled. Mechanical failure, I told myself. Coincidence layered with stress. At approximately 5:50 p.m., as dusk settled, I attempted to step outside again to collect a data point from the fuel tank gauge. This time, the door would not open at all. The bolt was retracted. The handle turned freely. The door remained immovable. I did not hear anything outside. I tested the radio. Signal was clear. I reported a door malfunction and requested a follow-up inspection the next day. The dispatcher acknowledged the message without concern. I did not mention the earlier incident. There was no appropriate category for it, and I did not want it dismissed as imagination. As night fell, the situation escalated. At 8:12 p.m., I heard footsteps outside the outpost. They were slow, heavy, and uneven, crunching lightly against gravel and frozen soil. I moved toward the door, listening. The footsteps approached, then stopped directly in front of it. I could see the handle from where I stood. It did not move. Instead, I heard breathing. It was faint but unmistakable, coming from just beyond the door, accompanied by a low, irregular exhale, as if whoever was there was struggling to maintain a steady rhythm. I held my breath, listening. The breathing grew closer, louder, right up against the metal. The deadbolt slid open. I watched it happen. The bolt retracted fully, smoothly, without hesitation. I did not touch it. I did not hear any mechanical failure. The handle turned. I stepped back as the door opened inward once again, revealing nothing. The breathing stopped instantly. I stood there for a long time, staring into the darkness beyond the doorway, my flashlight beam cutting through empty air. No movement, no sound. The forest remained unnaturally still. When I finally closed the door and locked it again, my hands were shaking. At 9:30 p.m., I stopped trying to rationalize. I sat at the desk, recording everything in my log with precise timestamps, careful wording, and neutral language. I convinced myself that documenting it properly would restore some sense of control. I told myself I would endure the night and leave at first light. That plan ended at 11:04 p.m. I had just stood up from the desk and decided to attempt another radio call when the outpost door locked itself. The deadbolt slid forward without warning, slamming into place with enough force to reverberate through the room. I rushed to the door and tried to pull it open. It would not move. I tried to retract the bolt. It did not budge. That was when I heard something approaching from outside. Slow, deliberate, purposeful. As the sound drew closer, the deadbolt retracted on its own. The door unlocked. And I understood with absolute clarity that the outpost was not malfunctioning. It was responding. I did not open the door. I stepped back until my shoulders touched the far wall, keeping my eyes fixed on the handle, as if looking away might somehow invite it to move again. The sound outside continued to approach, slow and deliberate, stopping only when it reached the threshold. I could hear it clearly now, not footsteps exactly, but the pressure of something shifting its weight on the ground, testing, balance, adjusting position. The deadbolt remained retracted. The door was unlocked. The handle did not turn. Minutes passed. My sense of time fractured, stretching thin under the weight of waiting. I counted my breaths to keep myself grounded, noting how the generator's low hum suddenly felt too loud, too present. The radio crackled once with static and then fell silent again. Eventually, the sound outside retreated. I waited long after it faded, standing frozen until my legs began to ache and my fingers went numb. Only then did I move forward and slide the deadbolt back into place. This time, it locked without resistance. The click echoed in the small room like punctuation at the end of a sentence I did not understand. I did not sleep. I sat on the cot with my boots still on, flashlight in my hand, watching the door. Every few minutes I checked my watch, marking the passage of time even though it felt unreal. At 12:17 a.m., the radio emitted a single burst of static. At 12:42 a.m., the generator fluctuated briefly, dipping just low enough to make the overhead light flicker. At 1:06 a.m., I heard something brush against the wall again. This time it did not stop at the door. It moved along the exterior, circling the outpost slowly, deliberately, like something learning the shape of a structure by touch. I tracked the sound as it passed from wall to wall, my heart hammering harder with each step it took. When it reached the back corner, I realized something that made my stomach tighten. The outpost only had one door. There were no windows. Whatever was outside did not need to see me to know exactly where I was. At 1:19 a.m., the sound stopped. The deadbolt slid open. I did not see it move at first. I felt it. Felt the vibration through the floorboards as the mechanism disengaged. I rushed to the door, gripping the bolt with both hands, trying to force it back into place. It would not move. The metal felt cold, unresponsive, as if it were no longer part of the door at all. The handle turned slowly. I shouted without thinking, my voice loud and brittle in the confined space. The handle stopped mid-turn. For a brief, fragile moment, I thought it had worked, that whatever was outside had been startled or discouraged. Then the handle resumed turning. The door opened a few inches and stopped again, as it had before. I stood there, frozen, staring at the narrow black gap between the door and the frame. There was no breathing this time. No sound at all. I raised the flashlight with a shaking hand and aimed it at the opening. The beam illuminated nothing but empty air and the edge of the clearing beyond. No movement, no shadow. The darkness outside felt flat, almost artificial, as if the light were being absorbed rather than reflected. I slammed the door shut and threw my weight against it, sliding the deadbolt forward by force rather than mechanism. It locked with a harsh metallic scrape, resisting me until the final inch. I backed away slowly, my chest tight, my thoughts racing. Something was wrong in a way that could not be explained by faulty equipment or stress. The door was not failing randomly. It was acting with intent, responding differently depending on what was happening outside. Locked when I tried to leave, unlocked when something approached. At 2:03 a.m., I made another radio call. I kept my voice calm, professional, reporting a persistent mechanical issue with the outpost door and requesting immediate guidance. The response was delayed by several seconds, longer than usual. When it came, the dispatcher's voice sounded distorted, stretched thin by interference. "Michael, confirm your status," she said. "I'm secure inside," I replied. "Door is malfunctioning. I recommend postponing departure until daylight." There was a pause. Static filled the channel, rising and falling like distant wind. "Michael," the dispatcher said again, slower this time. "There is no scheduled occupancy at that outpost tonight." I felt a chill crawl up my spine. "I'm aware," I said carefully. "I was assigned the overnight inspection." Another pause. Longer this time. "Our records show the inspection was completed yesterday," she said. "The outpost should be vacant." I checked my watch. The date was correct. I checked my logbook. My handwriting filled the last several pages. Timestamps precise, consistent, undeniably mine. "I'm here now," I said. "I arrived at 10:40 a.m. today." Silence. Then, faintly, I heard something else through the radio. Breathing. Not mine. I pulled the radio away from my ear, staring at it as if it had betrayed me. The dispatcher's voice returned, sharp and urgent. "Michael, are you alone?" Before I could answer, the radio cut out completely. At 2:41 a.m., the outpost door unlocked again. This time, it did not open. It remained closed, the deadbolt retracted, the handle untouched. I approached slowly, watching for movement. Nothing happened. Minutes passed. I stood there, uncertain whether locking it again would make things worse. A thought occurred to me then, unwelcome and heavy. The door was not simply responding to presence. It was choosing. At 3:12 a.m., I heard footsteps inside the outpost. They were soft, careful, moving across the floor behind me. I turned too quickly, my flashlight beam swinging wildly across the room. The cot, the desk, the radio console, everything was exactly where it should be. No one else was there. The sound stopped the instant I faced it. I stood there, light shaking in my hand, listening. Nothing. I checked the floor. No footprints. No disturbance. I told myself it was fatigue. Auditory hallucination brought on by stress and lack of sleep. Then the footsteps resumed. This time they were closer. They stopped just behind me. I spun around again, heart pounding, and again found nothing. The room was empty, unchanged, silent. The deadbolt slid forward. Locked. I stared at the door, realization dawning slowly, horribly. Whatever was outside was no longer the only thing the outpost was responding to. At 4:00 a.m., the generator shut off. The lights went out instantly, plunging the room into darkness. I stood there, frozen, listening to the sudden absence of sound. The silence pressed in on me, thick and absolute. Then I heard the door unlock. In the darkness, I heard the handle turn. And this time, the door opened all the way. I did not scream when the door opened. I did not run. My body refused both options, locking me in place as the darkness beyond the threshold seemed to thicken rather than recede. The flashlight beam trembled in my hand, cutting a narrow cone of light into the night outside. It showed the clearing exactly as it should have been. Trees standing motionless, ground undisturbed, the air empty. And yet the outpost felt occupied. I could feel it with the same certainty that tells you someone is standing behind you, even before you turn around. The room was no longer neutral space. It was attentive, aware. I forced myself to step forward. The moment my boot crossed the threshold, the flashlight flickered. Not off, just dimmer, as if something were drawing power from it. I froze, half in and half out, heart hammering. The forest remained silent. No wind, no insects, no distant animal calls. The silence felt maintained, like a rule being enforced. I stepped back inside. The door slammed shut behind me. The impact was violent enough to shake the walls. Before I could react, the deadbolt shot forward, locking with a force that sent a sharp metallic crack through the room. I stumbled away, nearly losing my footing, breathing hard. The generator remained off. The only light came from the flashlight, its beam now weaker, its edges fraying. I checked my watch. 40:07 a.m. I told myself that daylight was close, that whatever this was would lose its advantage once the sun came up. That thought did not bring comfort. It felt like an assumption made without evidence. At 40:19 a.m., the radio turned on by itself. The speaker emitted a low hiss of static, then settled into a quiet channel. I approached it cautiously, kneeling beside the desk. The display glowed faintly, powered by the backup battery. I did not touch any controls. "Michael," a voice said. It was not distorted. It was not crackling. It was clear, steady, and unmistakably my own. I felt my stomach drop. "Michael," the voice repeated. "You can go now." I did not answer. The radio clicked, then continued. "The door is unlocked." I looked over my shoulder. The deadbolt was still engaged. "You don't have to stay," the voice said. "You've done your part." My hands were shaking so badly, I had to clench them into fists to steady myself. I reached out and shut the radio off. The room fell silent again. At 4:36 a.m., I heard movement outside. It was faster this time. Purposeful. Whatever restraint had existed earlier was gone. Something circled the outpost, not brushing the walls now but striking them. Light impacts. Like knuckles tapping metal, testing strength. The sound passed from wall to wall in quick succession. The deadbolt rattled. I backed away, pressing myself into the corner farthest from the door. The flashlight flickered again, briefly dimming until the beam was barely visible. The tapping outside grew more insistent. Then it stopped. The deadbolt slid open. I shouted then. I do not remember what I said. It was not coherent. It was a reflexive, desperate sound torn from my chest. I rushed forward, grabbing the bolt, trying to force it back into place. It resisted, grinding against my grip, vibrating beneath my hands like something alive. The handle turned. The door opened inward, slowly, smoothly, without resistance. There was something there this time. It stood just beyond the threshold, occupying space without fully resolving into shape. My flashlight beam did not reflect off it properly. The edges blurred, folding in on themselves, as if the light could not decide where the surface was. I could not identify features. No face, no limbs, but I knew without question that it was oriented toward me, watching. The air grew colder, sharp against my lungs. I felt pressure in my ears, like a sudden change in altitude. "You can leave," my voice said again, coming from behind me this time. I did not turn around. The thing outside shifted forward slightly. The door did not creak. The hinges did not protest. Everything moved too smoothly, too cleanly. I understood then. The outpost was not a shelter. It was a filter. It did not keep things out. It decided what stayed in. With a surge of panic-driven clarity, I lunged forward, slipping past the edge of the doorway. The cold hit me instantly, biting through my jacket. I ran. I did not look back. I did not stop to think. I ran straight into the clearing, into the trees, my boots pounding against frozen ground. Behind me, the door slammed shut. I heard the deadbolt lock. The forest erupted with sound all at once, wind rushing through branches, distant animal calls, the crunch of my own footsteps. The sudden return of noise was overwhelming, almost painful. I did not slow down until I reached the service road. I turned then, gasping for breath, and looked back. The outpost stood exactly where it should have been, silent and still, no sign of damage or disturbance. The door was closed. The clearing was empty. At 6:18 a.m., I reached my vehicle. The engine started on the first try. I drove until my hands stopped shaking. I reported the incident in full later that morning. The outpost was inspected the same day. The door functioned perfectly. The deadbolt showed no signs of wear or modification. The radio logs contained no record of transmissions during the night. The outpost has since been reassigned. I was not. I no longer accept overnight postings. I no longer stay in enclosed spaces alone. And I no longer trust doors that are too eager to protect me.